A young shepherd tossed a stone into a dark cave and heard the shatter of pottery. That chance moment in the dry cliffs near the Dead Sea cracked open one of history's greatest mysteries, leading to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. These ancient Jewish texts, hidden for 2,000 years, have completely rewritten our understanding of the Bible and a forgotten world. We are about to explore 50 of their most enigmatic writings, a real-life treasure hunt of ancient secrets and scholarly riddles. You will discover shocking prophecies, lost gospels, and a copper map to unimaginable treasure. What hidden truths were sealed inside those jars for centuries, and why were they buried in the first place? What would you risk to uncover a secret that could change everything? That single broken jar revealed a library hidden from the world. Of all the texts found, one stands apart for its breathtaking completeness. The Great Isaiah Scroll, unrolled, it stretches over 24 feet, a continuous sheet of leather containing the entire book of Isaiah. It is not a collection of fragments, but a whole book, a voice speaking directly from 2 centuries before the Common Era. Its preservation is nothing short of miraculous. The Hebrew script is clean and elegant, written in columns that have survived the millennia with stunning clarity. For scholars, this was not just a discovery, it was a revolution. Before the scroll was found, the oldest known Hebrew versions of Isaiah were from the Middle Ages, 1,000 years more recent. Suddenly, they had a time capsule, a chance to see the text as it was read 2,000 years ago. They held their breath, comparing this ancient scroll to the familiar later versions. Were the words the same? For the most part, the text was identical, a testament to the incredible accuracy of the scribes who copied it over the centuries. But then came the differences, the small, enigmatic variations that fuel endless debate. In a famous passage, the later texts speak of a suffering servant who was pierced for our transgressions. But the Dead Sea Scrolls version uses a different verb. It says they pierced, a small change from a word meaning wounded, shifting the nuance from a general injury to a specific violent act. Another passage talks about a shoot coming up from the stump of Jesse. The familiar text says a branch will grow from his roots. The scroll, however, says branches plural. A single messianic figure or a line of them, these are not just spelling errors. They are windows into ancient debates about prophecy and meaning, questions that were alive and unresolved when this scroll was new. To look at a photograph of this scroll is to look across time. You see the careful hand of the scribe, the natural imperfections in the leather, the very words that a community in the desert read and pondered, waiting for a fulfillment they believed was just around the corner. This was not a dead document, but a living hope preserved against all odds. But the Isaiah scroll was a text of prophecy and hope. Another scroll from the caves was a manual for war. The war scroll presents a vision of an ultimate, final battle, a 40-year conflict between the forces of light and the armies of darkness. This is not a simple historical account, it is an apocalyptic blueprint for the end of days. On one side stand the sons of light, the faithful of Israel, led by a figure called the Prince of the Congregation. Arrayed against them are the sons of darkness, a coalition of enemy nations and those who have abandoned the covenant commanded by the mysterious Belial. The scroll details this cosmic struggle with astonishing military precision. It outlines the exact formation of the troops, a massive front of shields and spears 7 lines deep. It describes the specific inscriptions to be written on the battle standards and the trumpets, each blast signaling a different maneuver, from an advance to a retreat to a call for divine aid. The weapons themselves are symbolic, their polished blades reflecting a spiritual purity as much as a physical threat. The most fascinating aspect is the direct role of the divine. This is not a war fought by human strength alone. The text describes angelic hosts fighting alongside the righteous, turning the conflict into a joint operation between heaven and earth. The Archangel Michael is named as a celestial general leading the holy ones into the fray. The victory ultimately is granted by God, a final, decisive act that establishes his kingdom forever. The central enigma of the War Scroll is its purpose. Was this a literal battle plan for a specific group, like the Essenes who many believe hid the scrolls, preparing for a real revolt against Rome? Or was it purely a theological allegory, a symbolic story about the eternal struggle between good and evil within the human soul? The answer likely lies somewhere in between. It reflects the militant messianic hopes of a people living under foreign occupation, yearning for a divine warrior to cleanse the world. They were not just waiting for a peaceful teacher, but for a general who would lead them to a victory so complete it would reshape creation itself. To read the War Scroll is to feel the tension of that time, the fervent belief that the final battle was not a distant myth, but an imminent event for which one must be prepared, both in spirit and in startling, tangible detail. While the War Scroll planned for a battle against external darkness, another text laid down the law for an internal revolution. The community rule is the constitution for a radical desert sect, a detailed blueprint for a holy life set completely apart from the world. This is the foundational document of the Yahad, a Hebrew word meaning the unity, a group most scholars identify as the Essenes. It paints a picture of a community living in self-imposed exile near the Dead Sea, their daily lives governed by a code of absolute purity and rigid discipline. To join this sacred brotherhood was not a simple decision. The community rule describes a meticulous, multi-year initiation process. A prospective member would first be examined by the community's leader. If accepted, he entered a first year of probation, learning the group's ways but not yet touching their pure food or drink. After a second year of scrutiny, he would swear a binding oath to return to the law of Moses with all his heart and soul. Only then was he considered a full member, his property and his labor merged completely with the community. Everything was shared, a stark rejection of wealth and personal possession. The text explicitly states that no one should be inferior to another, a radical notion of equality enforced by communal ownership. This strict hierarchy was not just about social order, it was a spiritual necessity. The ruins of Qumran, the settlement near the caves, give this text a physical home. The remains of ritual baths, a large dining hall, and a scriptorium for copying scrolls match the life described in the community rule perfectly. Here, in this harsh and isolated landscape, they sought to build a perfect society, a human mirror of the divine order. At the very heart of this rulebook lies its most enigmatic section, the treatise on the two spirits. This profound passage explains that humanity is caught in a cosmic tug-of-war. God has appointed two spirits for man to walk in until the time of his visitation, the spirit of truth and the spirit of deceit. The Prince of Light leads the children of righteousness, while the angel of darkness holds dominion over the children of deceit. Every human heart becomes a battlefield for these two forces. This was not a simple concept of good and evil, but a complex dualism that explained the internal struggles of every person. It gave a divine reason for the conflict they felt within themselves and saw in the world around them. The community believed their strict rules were a spiritual technology, a way to align themselves completely with the spirit of truth and purge the influence of deceit. Their entire way of life, from their shared meals to their ritual washings, was a conscious effort to choose one spirit over the other every single day. This text answers the why behind their extreme separation, revealing a worldview where every action, no matter how small, was part of a vast, invisible war for the human soul. From the rigid laws of the community, we now hear a single, trembling voice. The Thanksgiving hymns are a collection of poetic prayers so personal and emotionally raw they feel like a private diary discovered after 2,000 years. These are not dry liturgical rules, but passionate outpourings of gratitude, despair, and intimate communion with the divine. The author, whoever he was, describes himself as a man brought to the very brink, a vessel of clay shaken by a violent storm, rescued from the pit by God's direct intervention. He writes of being planted by an eternal spring, his branches reaching for the sky, a beautiful metaphor for a soul revived by grace. This is the language of personal salvation, of a relationship with God that is both terrifying and ecstatic. The central enigma of these hymns is their authorship. Many scholars hear the distinct voice of a specific leader, the enigmatic teacher of righteousness mentioned in other scrolls. They read these lines as his spiritual autobiography, composed during a period of intense persecution from a rival priest, the wicked priest. The hymns are filled with references to adversaries, to men who have laid a snare for the author and denounced him before the powerful. When the poet thanks God for delivering him from the lion's den, was he speaking of a literal prison or a spiritual crisis? The answer remains just out of reach. Yet other scholars argue these were communal prayers composed for the entire sect to sing, giving voice to the shared experiences of all its members. They provided a template for how to feel and how to pray, transforming individual suffering into a collective cry for mercy. This ambiguity makes the hymns even more powerful, as they can be read as both a singular confession and a universal song. Within their beautiful, often cryptic language, there are flashes of something even more profound. Some lines seem to point beyond the poet's own experience to a messianic figure. One hymn speaks of a marvelous counselor with his power and a throne of strength in the congregation of the gods. Is this a vision of a future redeemer or a poetic description of God's own majesty? Another passage describes a figure who will be called Wonderful, a prince of the multitude, a father to the righteous. These fleeting, mysterious phrases have fueled endless debate. Are they glimpses of a developed messianic belief, or simply the exalted language of praise? To read the thanksgiving hymns is to listen in on a whispered conversation between a human soul and its creator, a conversation filled with doubt, awe, and a desperate, unwavering hope for redemption that echoes across the centuries. Yet the personal prayers of the thanksgiving hymns were not the only text speaking of a conflict. One scroll in particular turned ancient prophecy into a direct, urgent commentary on current events. This is the Habakkuk Pesher, a document that reads like a secret decoder ring for the Bible. The word Pesher itself means interpretation, but it signifies a very specific kind. It is not a general explanation. It is the explosive belief that an ancient prophet like Habakkuk was not writing for his own time, but was encoding a message specifically for the commentator's era, for the very community reading the scroll. The text is laid out in a fascinating pattern. First, it quotes a few lines from the biblical book of Habakkuk. Then, it immediately follows with its interpretation, introduced by the simple, powerful phrase, its Pesher concerns. The prophet Habakkuk had written about the terrifying rise of the Chaldeans, a brutal ancient empire. He asked God why he remained silent while the wicked swallowed up the righteous. For the author of the Pesher, this was not ancient history. This was the headline news of his own life. The interpretation is breathtaking in its directness. The Chaldeans, the text declares, are the Kittim. This is almost certainly a coded name for the Romans, the superpower of the day, whose legions were sweeping across the known world. The scroll describes the Kittim as sacrificing to their standards and worshipping their weapons, a chillingly accurate depiction of Roman military practice. But the real drama lies in how the Pesher applies other prophecies. Habakkuk writes, "The righteous shall live by his faith." The Pesher explains this refers to all those in the house of Judah who observe the law of God, meaning the faithful members of the sect itself. Then comes the most personal layer. The biblical text speaks of a traitor, one who builds a town with blood. The Pesher unflinchingly states its interpretation concerns the wicked priest who was called by the name of truth at the beginning, but who then abandoned God and betrayed the laws for the sake of wealth. This wicked priest, the text says, pursued the teacher of righteousness even to his house of exile to consume him with the heat of his anger. The enigma here is a historian's dream and nightmare. Who were these two shadowy figures, the righteous teacher and his wicked persecutor? The teacher of righteousness was almost certainly the revered founding leader of the sect. But the wicked priest remains one of the great unsolved puzzles. Was he a specific Hasmonean high priest, a Jewish ruler who had compromised with foreign powers and persecuted the pure faith of the desert community? Candidates range from Alexander Jannaeus, a ruthless king and priest, to Jonathan Apphus, who assumed the high priesthood amid political turmoil. The text gives us clues but no definitive name. It tells us the wicked priest was punished by God, handed over to his enemies for his sins against the teacher. The Habakkuk Pesher transforms the biblical text from a timeless moral lesson into a thrilling, dangerous political allegory. It reveals a community that saw itself as the central character in the final act of God's plan, living out prophecies written centuries before. They were not just studying scripture, they were living inside of it with their own heroes and villains playing divinely ordained roles. To read this scroll is to witness a group using the ultimate authority, the Word of God itself, to make sense of their own persecution and to affirm their ultimate vindication. While the Habakkuk Pesher interpreted prophecy as a present conflict, one scroll dared to rewrite the law itself. The Temple Scroll is the longest of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, a massive document that unfurls a breathtaking vision. This text makes an audacious claim, presenting itself not as a mere commentary, but as a new Torah given by God directly to Moses. It is divine legislation for a future age, a blueprint for a kingdom so perfect it had never existed on earth. The voice of the scroll is God speaking in the first person, delivering laws for a new covenant. This was a radical act, suggesting that the existing Torah was insufficient for the final days, and that this new revelation was the ultimate guide. Imagine the sheer nerve required to compose such a text, to claim a voice so authoritative it could speak as God. The heart of this scroll is its painstaking description of a future temple, a structure of unimaginable grandeur and ritual purity. The specifications are not vague ideals, they are precise architectural commands. The text dictates the exact dimensions of the temple complex, a perfect square with 3 concentric courtyards, each one representing a higher degree of holiness. It describes the number of gates, 12 in total, each named for one of the 12 tribes of Israel. It details the materials, the placement of the altars, and even the specialized rooms for the priests. This was not just a building, it was a cosmic diagram, a physical representation of a universe in perfect order with God at its center. But the scroll goes far beyond architecture. It interweaves these building plans with a complete revision of religious law. It expands and modifies the laws of Deuteronomy and Leviticus, often making them more stringent. It outlines a detailed festival calendar, introduces new holy days, and lays out rules for the king, the army, and even the city of the sanctuary itself. One of its most striking laws concerns the temple's latrines. It mandates that they be built far outside the city walls to ensure that the holy city remains ritually pure, a direct and obvious critique of the practices in contemporary Jerusalem. This is the key to the central enigma of the Temple Scroll. Who would write such a document and why? The answer lies in the scroll's implicit condemnation of the Jerusalem that was. The ruling Hasmonean dynasty served as both kings and high priests, a fusion of political and religious power that the authors of this scroll saw as a profound corruption. For them, the Jerusalem temple was defiled, its priesthood illegitimate, and its rituals impure. The temple scroll is their ultimate protest. It is not a plan for renovation. It is a declaration that the entire system is broken and must be replaced. By presenting a perfect divine blueprint, they were effectively putting the current establishment on trial and finding it guilty. The scroll reveals a community that had given up on reforming the present and had instead turned its gaze to the future, to a time when God would intervene, sweep away the corrupt institutions, and establish his kingdom based on this new, perfect law. They were not just waiting for a Messiah, they were drafting the constitution for his reign. This magnificent, arrogant text is a testament to a faith so certain of its own purity that it dared to speak with the voice of God, offering a law for a world that had yet to be born. While the temple scroll spoke with the voice of God, another text offered the intimate voices of patriarchs. The Genesis Apocryphon is a literary treasure, one of the very first scrolls pulled from the caves. Written not in Hebrew but in the everyday Aramaic of the time, it does something remarkable. It takes the sparse, sometimes cryptic stories from the book of Genesis and breathes vibrant life into them, expanding the biblical narrative with rich, first-person details that feel like listening to ancient memoirs. This scroll reveals a world hungry for more than just the official scripture, a world where sacred stories were alive and growing. We hear directly from the patriarchs themselves. Noah describes his own birth in a scene of wonder and terror. He tells us that when he was born, his father Lamech was filled with fear. The infant was so radiant, so unlike any other child, that Lamech suspected he was not his own son, but rather a child of the mysterious watchers, the fallen angels from Genesis. Lamech runs to his own father, Methuselah, begging him to question the great sage Enoch for the truth. The story unfolds with a family's desperation to understand a miracle in their midst, a human drama of doubt and divine purpose completely absent from the biblical account. Later, we step into the sandals of Abraham. The scroll recounts his journey into Egypt during a famine, but from Abraham's own perspective. He has a dream the night before he crosses the border, a dream of a magnificent cedar tree. Men arrive with axes to cut it down, but a single man intervenes and saves the tree. Abraham understands the dream's meaning. The cedar is himself and the danger is real. He then reveals the central strategy for his survival. He tells his beautiful wife, Sarai, to pretend to be his sister, a story present in the Bible. But the Apocryphon adds a stunning new layer. Abraham, in his own words, describes Sarai's breathtaking beauty. He then looks into a reflecting pool and sees his own appearance. He realizes with shock that his own majesty and handsome face are so great that the Egyptians will surely kill him to take her. This is a far cry from the elderly patriarch of tradition. This is a story of a man whose very beauty becomes a lethal liability. The narrative continues with vivid detail, describing how Pharaoh's officials praise Sarai's beauty to him, leading to her being taken into the royal house. The text even includes Pharaoh's own poetic attempt to woo her, a unique and fascinating expansion. God then afflicts Pharaoh with a plague, preventing him from touching Sarai, and the truth is revealed. This is where the central enigma of the Genesis Apocryphon lies. Why was this text written? Was it simply popular religious fiction, a way to make the old stories more entertaining and relatable for a general audience? Or was it a serious theological work, an attempt to resolve ambiguities in the biblical text and reinforce specific beliefs? For the desert sect, it may have served a deeper purpose. By emphasizing the righteousness and divine favor of figures like Noah and Abraham, who also lived as strangers in a corrupt world, the text could have validated the community's own choice to separate themselves. It showed that God had always protected his chosen ones from the impurity of foreign rulers, a powerful message for a group living under Roman occupation. The existence of the Genesis Apocryphon proves that the biblical world was not static. It was a living, breathing universe of story, where the gaps in the sacred text were not seen as empty spaces, but as invitations to wonder, to imagine, and to hear the whispered secrets of the past. But the scrolls were not all made of fragile leather. One was forged from metal. The copper scroll stands utterly apart from every other discovery, a cryptic list inscribed not on parchment but on thin sheets of copper, a material chosen to endure. This was not a spiritual text or a biblical commentary. It was a treasure map. The scroll details 64 separate caches of unimaginable wealth, a fortune that includes vast quantities of gold and silver, precious perfumes, and sacred religious artifacts, possibly even from the legendary Temple of Jerusalem itself. The sheer scale is staggering, described in talents, a unit of weight equivalent to about 75 pounds. One entry alone mentions a deposit of 900 talents of silver. We are talking about a hoard worth billions in today's currency, a king's ransom hidden somewhere in the arid landscape of Judea. The difficulty of reading this map was immense. The copper was so heavily oxidized and brittle that scholars could not simply unroll it without the entire thing crumbling to dust. For years, the scroll remained a sealed, unreadable mystery. The solution was as daring as the text itself. Experts carefully sawed the scroll into tiny strips like slicing a fragile cigar to flatten the segments and finally reveal the message etched into the metal 2,000 years ago. The text itself is maddeningly direct and yet completely obscure. It reads like ancient GPS coordinates without a starting point. One typical instruction might say, in the salt pit that is under the steps, 42 talents of silver are buried. Another directs the seeker to the tomb of the third conduit, or to a place where two aqueducts meet. These are not street names. They are landmarks that would have been familiar to people at the time but are now lost to history. The central enigma is as sharp as the copper it was written on. Is this a real inventory of a genuine treasure? Many believe it records the sacred wealth of the Second Temple, hidden away by priests just before the Roman legions sacked Jerusalem in the year 70. This would make the copper scroll a desperate attempt to preserve the nation's most holy objects from desecration. Others argue it is a fictional or symbolic list, perhaps describing a spiritual treasure that is not of this earth. And some propose a more local theory that it details the communal treasury of the Qumran sect itself, their shared wealth buried for safekeeping. This theory, however, struggles with the colossal sums described, far beyond what a small desert community would likely possess. The copper scroll has sent generations of treasure hunters into the deserts and hills of Israel and Jordan, armed with shovels and a fragile hope. They have dug at the base of cliffs, scanned caves with ground-penetrating radar, and followed dry riverbeds, all chasing a 2,000-year-old ghost. No significant part of this treasure has ever been found. The ground has kept it secret, so the mystery endures, a tangible, metallic whisper from the past that dares us to solve its riddle. Was this a practical guide to a real fortune, or was the treasure itself always the act of seeking, a test of faith for those who believed the earth itself could be made holy again? The metallic whisper of the copper scroll promised treasures of this world, but another text from the caves offered a treasure of an entirely different kind, a journey into the very architecture of heaven and the origins of evil itself. This is the Book of Enoch, a work so influential it shaped the worldviews of early Judaism and Christianity, yet it was ultimately left out of the Hebrew Bible. At Qumran, multiple fragmentary copies were discovered, proving this was no obscure curiosity, but a vital text for the desert community. Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, was the biblical figure who walked with God and was taken, never experiencing death. This book claims to be his own account of the celestial secrets revealed to him. It begins with a story of catastrophic rebellion. 200 angels, called the Watchers, look down from heaven and lust after the beautiful daughters of men. Their leader, Shemhazer, leads them in a mutual oath to descend to earth, take human wives, and beget children. This union produces a race of violent giants who ravage the earth, consuming all the resources of humanity. But the Watchers also commit a second, more subtle transgression. They impart forbidden knowledge to their human wives, teaching them the arts of metalworking to create swords and armor, the secrets of sorcery, and how to make cosmetics and jewelry, which the text portrays as tools of deception and corruption. This is the Enochian explanation for the explosion of violence and evil that led to the Great Flood. The children of the Watchers, the giants, are slain in the deluge, but their immortal souls become the evil spirits and demons that plague humanity to this day. This single, powerful narrative provided an answer to one of religion's most difficult questions: where did evil come from? It was not a human invention, but a cosmic contamination, a fall from above that corrupted the world below. Enoch himself is not a passive observer. The book describes his breathtaking journeys through the multi-layered heavens, guided by angels. He is shown the storehouses of the winds, the foundations of the earth, and the prison where the fallen watchers are bound in darkness, awaiting final judgment. He witnesses the very throne of God, surrounded by fiery, many-eyed beings known as the cherubim. This is a guided tour of the universe's spiritual mechanics, a cosmology that satisfied a deep hunger to understand the hidden order behind the visible world. Perhaps the most practical revelation for the Qumran community was Enoch's solar calendar. He is shown the perfect 364-day year divided into 4 equal seasons. This was far more than an agricultural guide. It was a theological statement. The lunar calendar used by the temple authorities in Jerusalem was, in the eyes of the sect, flawed and irregular, causing holy days to be celebrated on the wrong dates. Enoch's perfect solar calendar was a direct challenge to the establishment, proof that their own rituals were out of sync with the divine clockwork of the universe. The central enigma of the Book of Enoch is its legacy. Why was this text, so popular and widely read, eventually excluded from the official Hebrew Bible? Its cosmic scope and detailed angelology were likely seen as too speculative, drifting from the core legal and historical focus of the Torah. Its depiction of sinful angels may have been considered theologically risky. Yet its influence did not disappear. Its ideas echo throughout the New Testament. The letter of Jude directly quotes from the Book of Enoch. The concept of the fallen angels, the final judgment, and even the title Son of Man used by Jesus find powerful parallels in this ancient text. The Dead Sea Scrolls fragments confirm that this was not a fringe idea, but a cornerstone of belief for a significant strand of Judaism, a mystical and apocalyptic tradition that saw the world as a battleground between divine and demonic forces. To read Enoch is to peer into a lost corridor of history, to see a version of faith that was filled with cosmic voyages, rebellious angels, and a desperate hope for a final cleansing of a world broken by a heavenly war. The cosmic battles of Enoch introduced a calendar aligned with the heavens, but another scroll from the caves used that very calendar to rewrite sacred history from the beginning. The Book of Jubilees presents itself as a secret revelation given to Moses on Mount Sinai, a divine retelling of Genesis and Exodus that fills in every gap and answers every question left open by the original text. This is not a mere commentary, it is a rewritten Bible, a bold theological project that seeks to leave no mystery unsolved. The book's very structure is a radical reordering of time. It divides all of history into jubilees, cycles of 49 years, with each jubilee itself subdivided into 7-year weeks. This creates a rigid, predictable timeline from the creation of the world, a countdown of divinely appointed epochs. Every event is locked into its specific jubilee and year, giving human history a sense of predetermined order and meaning. This chronology is built upon Enoch's perfect solar calendar of 364 days, a calendar that never shifts and never falls out of sync with the seasons. For the Qumran community, this was further proof that their sect alone was keeping time correctly, while the temple in Jerusalem, with its lunar calculations, was perpetually celebrating God's feasts on the wrong days. The Book of Jubilees tackles profound theological problems by inserting new, heavenly dialogues. The origin of evil, so vividly described in Enoch, is here directly linked to a specific event. The text reveals that after the flood, Noah's grandchildren began to separate themselves from one another, and this division was the original sin. But the real catalyst was the angels God had sent to instruct humanity. These angels, led by the figure Mastema, the accuser, then lead mankind astray, encouraging them to worship idols and shed blood. This provides a clear, celestial reason for the laws that follow, framing them as a divine antidote to a demonic infection. The book answers questions the Bible never addresses. Why, for instance, was Abraham so uniquely faithful? Jubilees explains that as a child, he refused to help his father make idols, realizing the folly of worshipping carved wood. In a dramatic scene, he prays to the one true God to save him from these evil spirits, and God sends an angel to teach him the Hebrew language, which had been lost since the time of the Tower of Babel. This single addition transforms Abraham from a passive figure into an active, rational seeker of truth who heroically rejects the corruption of his family. The laws of Moses are also given a prehistory. The rules for observing the Sabbath, for dietary restrictions, and for circumcision are all presented as eternal ordinances that were known and kept by the patriarchs long before Sinai. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all faithfully observed the Festival of Weeks. This retroactive law-keeping makes the entire Torah not a new revelation at Sinai, but the restoration of a primordial covenant that humanity had forgotten. The central enigma of the Book of Jubilees is its staggering authority. For the community at Qumran, this was not interesting folklore, it was scripture. Its voice carries the same weight as the books of Moses, and it was copied and studied with the same reverence. Its presence among the Dead Sea Scrolls challenges our modern assumption of a fixed, unchanging biblical canon. It reveals a time when the boundaries of Holy Writ were still fluid, when multiple texts competed for the status of divine revelation. A community could treat Jubilees as the literal word of God, a key that unlocked the hidden meaning of the entire past. This text forces us to wonder what makes a book sacred. Is it its age, its tradition, or simply the powerful conviction of a people who heard God speaking to them through its pages, rewriting their world with a celestial clock and the whispers of angels? Deathbed confessions carry a unique power, a final chance to impart a lifetime of wisdom. At Qumran, fragments of Aramaic text offer us exactly that, whispers from the deathbeds of the 12 sons of Jacob. These are the earliest known pieces of a work later known as the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. In these texts, each patriarch from Reuben to Benjamin gathers his children and delivers a final speech. The structure is always the same. First, he recounts a pivotal story from his own life, often a moment of moral failure. Reuben confesses his sin with his father's concubine, Bilhah, warning his sons against the lust and pride that led him astray. Simon admits to the jealousy that fueled his violence against Joseph. Judah delivers a remarkably candid account of his own weaknesses. These are not heroic boasts, but raw, human admissions of guilt presented as cautionary tales for the generations to come. Following this confession comes a section of ethical instruction, a set of core virtues the sons must embrace. Levi exhorts his children to pursue righteousness and wisdom. Joseph holds himself up as a model of self-control and forgiveness in the face of betrayal. The teachings are deeply practical, focusing on integrity, compassion, and purity of heart, creating a clear moral compass for a community striving to live apart from a world they saw as corrupt. But the final part of each testament shifts dramatically from ethics to prophecy. As each patriarch nears the end of his speech, his gaze turns to the distant future. He begins to foretell what will happen to his descendants in the last days. The tribes of Israel are not just historical entities, they are actors in a final, apocalyptic drama. These predictions are often bleak, forecasting a period of great suffering, dispersion, and conflict. Yet they also point to a future hope, a time when God will intervene, and a messianic figure from the line of Levi or Judah will arise to bring salvation and judgment. This seamless blend is the text's great innovation, tightly weaving personal morality into the vast tapestry of God's cosmic plan. Your individual choice to resist sin is not just a private matter, It is a decisive act in a spiritual war whose final battle is already written in the stars. The central enigma of these fragments lies in their relationship to the much fuller, complete versions of the Testaments that survived through the centuries in Christian circles. The full text, preserved in Greek and other languages, contains unmistakable Christian ideas, including clear references to Jesus as the Messiah. The Aramaic fragments from Qumran, however, show no such signs. They are purely Jewish in their concerns and their apocalyptic vision. This presents scholars with a fascinating puzzle. Did the Qumran community possess an original Jewish version of the Testaments that was later expanded and edited by Christian authors who saw in its prophecies a perfect template for their beliefs about Jesus? Or was the process more complex, with both groups drawing from a common pool of Jewish traditions about the patriarchs, each shaping the material for their own theological needs? The fragments suggest a shared literary world, a vibrant tradition of expanding the biblical narrative that was not the exclusive property of any single group. It reveals a time when the boundaries between what would become Judaism and Christianity were still porous, when stories of the 12 sons of Jacob could inspire powerful ethical and prophetic teachings on both sides of a divide that had not yet fully hardened. These tattered pieces of parchment are more than just an ancient book. They are a testament to a conversation that once was, a dialogue between two faiths born from the same soil, both listening for the final words of the sons of Israel. Death is the final enemy, a universal truth no one escapes, but one fragment from the caves dared to challenge this ancient verdict. Known as the Messianic Apocalypse, this text, catalogued as 4Q521, is a brief but electrifying glimpse into a future overturned. It describes a time when the heavens and the earth will listen to his Messiah, and the Lord himself will perform glorious wonders. Its most stunning declaration is just a few words long, a phrase that would have shaken the ancient world to its core. It says the Lord will make the dead live. This is not merely a hope for spiritual resurrection, but a physical one, a belief that the graves themselves will one day be emptied. The text lists the Messiah's mission with poetic power. He will liberate the captives, open the eyes of the blind, and raise up those who are bowed down. For any reader of the New Testament, these words ring with an unmistakable echo. Centuries later, the Gospels recount that followers of Jesus came to John the Baptist, asking if he was the promised one. Jesus sent back a message telling them to report what they saw. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, and the poor have good news preached to them. The parallel is not just similar, it is a direct literary and theological link, drawing from a shared well of Jewish messianic hope. This connection forms the central enigma of the text. Who is this Messiah? The language of the fragment is both singular and potentially plural. It speaks of his Messiah, but the context of other Dead Sea Scrolls reveals that this community often awaited two Messiahs, one a royal figure from the line of Judah, and the other a priestly figure from the line of Levi. Was this text envisioning a single, ultimate Redeemer, or was it describing the collective work of multiple anointed ones ushering in God's kingdom? The answer is fragmented, just like the scroll itself. Some phrases seem to point to a divine agent through whom God acts, while the overall picture fits the two Messiah model cherished at Qumran. This ambiguity makes the text a key piece of the puzzle, a bridge between diverse Jewish expectations and the crystallized Christian claim of a single, unique Son of God. It proves that the ideas of a miracle-working Messiah who conquers death itself were not invented by the early church, but were alive and debated in the desert centuries before. The Messianic Apocalypse reveals a world aching for a redemption so complete it would rewrite the very rules of existence, where the last enemy would be defeated and the universe itself would finally listen. A tiny, damaged fragment held one of the most explosive titles in religious history. Known as the Son of God text, this Aramaic scrap from Cave 4 is a mere handful of lines, yet its words have ignited a firestorm of debate that cuts to the very heart of messianic expectation. The text describes a period of great turmoil with kingdoms rising and falling in violence. Then a figure emerges. The text declares he will be called the Son of God, and they will call him the Son of the Most High. The language is majestic and unequivocal, but the identity of this son is the great enigma. Who is being named here? Scholars have proposed three radically different answers, each transforming the meaning of the fragment. The first interpretation sees a positive, earthly Messiah. In this reading, the figure is a human king, a descendant of David who will restore Israel. The titles Son of God and Son of the Most High were used in the ancient Near East for kings, denoting their special, adopted status as God's representative on earth. This would be a royal, political liberator, anointed by God to rule in a new age of peace. The second interpretation is far darker. It suggests this figure is not a savior but a villain. He could be an arrogant pagan ruler, a Seleucid emperor like Antiochus Epiphanes, who famously desecrated the Jerusalem temple and claimed divine honors for himself. In this bleak view, the titles Son of God are a bitter irony, a description of the ultimate blasphemer who temporarily seizes power during the final tribulations. The text would be a warning, not a promise. The third possibility is the most theologically staggering. This interpretation argues that the text points to a heavenly, divine figure, a pre-existent being who descends from the spiritual realm to enact God's judgment and rule. This is not a metaphor for a human king, but a claim about a celestial entity who shares in the very identity of the Most High. For the community at Qumran, which often blended human and angelic figures in its writings, this was not an unthinkable concept. The mystery deepens when you hold this fragment beside the Christian New Testament. The angel Gabriel's words to Mary in the Gospel of Luke are almost a direct quotation. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The linguistic echo is undeniable. This does not mean the Qumran community was Christian, but it proves that the precise language used to describe Jesus was already circulating in Jewish apocalyptic thought a century before. The title Son of God was part of a living, breathing Jewish conversation about how God would save his people. Was it through a human king, a divine being, or was the world first destined to be deceived by a false god? This tiny, frayed piece of parchment offers no final answer, only a profound question hanging in the dry desert air, a question that would, for millions, eventually find its answer in a stable in Bethlehem. From a human son of God, the scrolls shift their gaze to a being who was never human at all. The Melchizedek scroll unearths one of the Bible's most cryptic characters and elevates him to a cosmic role. In the Book of Genesis, Melchizedek appears without warning, a priest king of Salem who blesses Abraham and then vanishes from the narrative. The text gives him no genealogy, no beginning, and no end. For centuries, this enigmatic figure was a theological ghost. The Dead Sea Scrolls shatter that silence. In this remarkable text, Melchizedek is no longer a fleeting historical priest, but a powerful, heavenly being who will return at the end of days. He is transformed into a divine judge, a celestial agent of God's final justice. The scroll reinterprets a passage from the Book of Leviticus about the year of Jubilee, a time when debts were forgiven and slaves were set free. But here, the Jubilee is not an earthly event. It is the ultimate cosmic liberation. Melchizedek is appointed to preside over this final Jubilee, a year of God's favor that will overturn the entire world order. His mission is to proclaim release for the captives, but these are not prisoners in a physical jail. The captives are the faithful, held in bondage by the power of the evil one, called here Belial or Satan. Melchizedek's court is a heavenly tribunal where he will execute the judgment of God, shattering the dominion of darkness and setting the righteous free forever. This portrayal creates a profound enigma. Who or what is this Melchizedek? The scroll offers tantalizing clues that point in several directions. He is called Elohim, a Hebrew word that usually means God, suggesting he is a manifestation of the divine presence itself. He stands at the head of the sons of God, a title for the angels, implying he is their chief, a supreme archangel, and he performs a priestly duty of atonement, a role reserved for a messianic figure. Is he an angel, a pre-existent divine being, or the ultimate prototype for a priestly Messiah? The text seems to blend all these identities into one majestic, terrifying figure. This developed angelology, this belief in a heavenly Redeemer who is both priest and king, did not emerge in a vacuum. It was the spiritual air that the earliest Christians breathed. When the New Testament letter to the Hebrews describes Jesus as a high priest forever, in the order of Melchizedek, it is drawing directly from this same well of thought. The idea of a divine figure who conquers Satan and liberates his people was being passionately explored in the desert a century before Paul ever wrote a letter. The Melchizedek scroll reveals a world where the boundary between heaven and earth was thin, where the heroes of old were seen as eternal, celestial powers waiting in the wings for their final world-altering command. While the Melchizedek scroll envisioned a heavenly judge, another text from the caves laid out the very streets he might one day walk. The New Jerusalem text provides a breathtaking, guided tour of a city so magnificent it could only exist in a dream or a prophecy. Written in Aramaic, this work reads like an angelic architect's walkthrough describing an immense, idealized Jerusalem and its temple with painstaking, almost overwhelming detail. The voice of the text is that of a seer, a narrator who is being shown this metropolis by a celestial guide, measuring every street and gate with a divine reed. The city is a perfect square, its dimensions so vast they dwarf human comprehension. Its walls are studded with 12 gates, each one named for a tribe of Israel and made of a single gigantic pearl. The text meticulously lists the measurements of the gates, the height of the walls, the width of the main streets paved with white stone, and the specific types of trees that line the boulevards bearing fruit every month of the year. This is not a simple sketch, it is a full sensory immersion into a world of impossible perfection. The central enigma of this text is its fundamental purpose. Is this a literal blueprint, a set of construction plans for a city that the community believed God would physically build in the future? Or is it a purely symbolic vision, a metaphor for a spiritual reality, a heavenly Jerusalem that would descend from the clouds at the end of time? The answer is likely that it was both. For a community that had rejected the corrupt and compromised Jerusalem of their day, this text was a declaration of hope. The actual city, with its Roman influences and politically appointed priests, was an abomination. Their vision, by contrast, was a city built to God's own specifications, a place where ritual purity was woven into the very masonry and divine order dictated the layout of every neighborhood. The fantastical scale itself is the message. The sheer size of the city, with walls as high as mountains and gates made of single jewels, communicates one thing clearly: the human Jerusalem they knew was only a shadow. The true city of God would be an entirely new creation, so glorious it would make the present world seem like a faint memory. This was not an architectural plan for human builders, but a divine promise that would require a cosmic act to realize. To read the New Jerusalem text is to witness a community consoling itself with a shared dream, a collective act of imagination so vivid and detailed it became a form of resistance against the disappointing reality of their present. They were not just waiting for a Messiah, they were memorizing the map of his capital, a city whose foundations were not of stone but of hope itself. The giants themselves began to dream. Within the tattered fragments known as the Book of Giants, the cosmic rebellion of the Watchers becomes terrifyingly personal. This text picks up the story where the Book of Enoch left off, zooming in on the monstrous children of the fallen angels, the Nephilim. We learn their names, giants like Ohia, Hahia, and Maweh, who are not just mindless brutes but conscious beings filled with dread. They are haunted by prophetic visions, their sleep shattered by nightmares of a great tablet being plunged into water. its writing washing away, and of a garden being uprooted save for a single shoot. These are dreams of annihilation, of a judgment that will erase their legacy and spare only a remnant. In their terror, the giant Moe undertakes a fantastic journey. He flies on his hands, traversing the world and then ascending through the skies to seek out the one person who might explain their fate, the ancient scribe Enoch. The dialogue that follows is a masterpiece of apocalyptic tension. Enoch, from his celestial vantage point, confirms their worst fears. The dreams are true. The flood is coming, a divine verdict against their very existence for the violence and corruption they have unleashed upon the earth. The central enigma of this text is its incredible journey. Copies of the Book of Giants were not confined to the caves of Qumran. Centuries later, fragments of this very same story, featuring the same giant Moe and his conversation with Enoch, were discovered thousands of miles to the east, translated into Middle Persian and other languages. They became a foundational text for Manichaeism, a major world religion that spread from North Africa to China. A Jewish story about pre-flood giants became a sacred narrative for Persian prophets. This proves these enigmatic texts were not hermetically sealed. They were living, breathing stories that escaped their original context, traveling along trade routes and evolving to meet the spiritual needs of new cultures. The whispers of the giants, first penned on the shores of the Dead Sea, eventually echoed in the temples of Central Asia, a testament to the boundless power of a compelling story. The giants' dreams of annihilation gave way to a community's detailed vision of its own glorious future. The rule of the congregation is a brief, potent text, a set of bylaws not for the present but for the end of days. It describes the ultimate gathering of the faithful, a time when the entire community, men, women, and children, would assemble under a new messianic order. This is not a vague prophecy of heavenly bliss, but a concrete plan for an earthly kingdom, a society rebuilt from the ground up according to the sect's own perfect law. At the heart of this vision lies a sacred meal of profound significance, the Messianic banquet. The text outlines the precise order of this final feast. The Anointed One, the Messiah of Israel, is to enter first. Then the priests would take their seats, followed by the elders, and finally all the rest of the people, arranged by their rank and status. The meal could not begin until the Messiah had blessed the first portion of the bread and the wine. Only after he had performed this sacred rite could the others partake. This was more than a dinner, it was a ritual of cosmic importance, a foretaste of the kingdom where God's anointed would preside over a renewed community. The central enigma of the text swirls around this presiding figure. The language is both singular and layered. It speaks of the Anointed One, but it also refers to the priest at the head of the congregation. This ambiguity points directly to the community's unique belief in two messiahs. One was the Messiah of Israel, a royal, Davidic figure who would lead the people in battle and governance. The other was the Messiah of Aaron, a priestly figure who would oversee all matters of worship and ritual purity. At this ultimate banquet, which one would take precedence? The text suggests they would rule in tandem, a perfect fusion of political and religious authority that stood in stark contrast to the corrupt Hasmonean rulers who had merged both roles into one. Yet even in this perfected future, the community's strict purity laws would remain in full force. This is one of the text's most revealing details. In the Messianic age, the blind and the lame, those with skin diseases or physical defects, were still forbidden from entering the assembly. The holy angels would be present among them, and no imperfection could be tolerated in their sight. This was not a vision of universal inclusion, but of absolute holiness. It shows a community whose identity was so deeply rooted in ritual separation that they could not imagine a future, even a redeemed one, without their defining boundaries. The rule of the congregation answers a fundamental question: what were they waiting for? They were not waiting to escape the earth, but to inherit it. They were preparing for a tangible, physical kingdom where their long-held rules would become the law of the land, enforced by God's own anointed ones. This short document is the ultimate act of preparation, a checklist for the end of the world, ensuring that when the Messiah finally arrived, they would know exactly how to set the table. But the rules for the Messianic banquet were not the only guidelines for the end of days. Another text from the caves, known as the Blessings of the Patriarchs, takes the ancient words of Jacob to his sons and rewrites them for a new age. This is a running commentary on the book of Genesis, but it is far from a dry academic exercise. It is a political and theological manifesto, reshaping the past to reveal a specific blueprint for the future. The author retells the blessings Jacob gave to his 12 sons, but the focus shifts dramatically. The text lavishes its greatest attention on the tribe of Judah, transforming the original blessing into a powerful prophecy about a coming Messiah. The commentary explicitly states that the royal scepter will not depart from the tribe of Judah, and it links this kingship directly to a figure it calls the Messiah of righteousness, the branch of David. This is a clear, emphatic statement of royal menism, a belief that God's ultimate redeemer would be a king from the line of Judah, the same royal house of King David, who would rule with justice and power. This creates a fascinating enigma when you place this scroll alongside other texts from Qumran. Here, the Messiah is a single royal figure from Judah. Yet, as we have seen, the rule of the congregation and other scrolls point to a belief in two messiahs, a king from Judah and a priest from Levi. How do we reconcile this? Was the community's belief evolving over time, perhaps starting with a focus on a Davidic king and later developing a more complex dual messiah theology? Or did different factions within the broader movement hold competing ideas about how the end would unfold? This scroll suggests that the messianic hope at Qumran was not a single monolithic doctrine, but a vibrant, sometimes contradictory conversation. The Blessings of the Patriarchs reveals a community deeply engaged with its scriptures, wrestling with the promises made to their ancestors and trying to decode their meaning for their own troubled era. They were not just copying texts, they were actively interpreting them, and in this case, bending the ancient words of Genesis to point toward a very specific hope, a righteous king who would grasp the scepter and finally bring God's judgment to the earth. This text is a vital piece of the puzzle, proving that the path to redemption was not a straight line, but a landscape of debate and fervent, competing expectations. Among the rules for the end of days, a quieter voice speaks of a more personal struggle. A small, fragile fragment known as the secret of the way things are offers a profound meditation on the human condition. This is not a battle plan or a temple blueprint, but a wisdom poem that delves into the deepest questions of the soul. Its poetic lines are a stark contrast to the rigid legal codes found in other caves, yet its message is just as demanding. The text begins with a humbling truth that humanity is fundamentally flawed, shaped from dust and destined to return to it. The poem describes the human spirit as wayward, prone to sin from its very inception. This is not a temporary condition, but the secret of the way things are, the foundational reality of human existence apart from divine intervention. The path of righteousness, therefore, is not something a person can simply choose through sheer willpower. The poem insists that true understanding and the ability to walk a righteous path are gifts from God, acts of divine grace that must be granted to a receptive heart. A person cannot know these things unless you, O God, open their heart, the text declares. This emphasis on grace is one of its most striking features, a spiritual insight that feels intimately personal. The central enigma is right there in its title. What was this secret knowledge the community believed it possessed? It was not a hidden fact about the stars or a prediction of future kings. The secret was this very understanding of human nature and divine grace. They believed they alone grasped the true, sobering reality of humanity's sinful state, and the corresponding absolute necessity for God's unmerited favor. This set them dramatically apart from the religious mainstream in Jerusalem, where they likely perceived a focus on ritual observance and national identity without this foundational, humbling self-awareness. They were not just a community with different rules, they were a community with a different anthropology, a different understanding of what it means to be human. To possess this secret was to see the world with unveiled eyes, to understand the fundamental problem and the only possible solution. This tiny fragment reveals that the heart of the Qumran community's identity was not merely their separation or their laws, but a specific, revelatory insight into the relationship between a sinful creature and a holy creator. They built their entire desert existence around this core truth, believing that only by acknowledging their own inherent inability could they truly prepare for the coming judgment. The human struggle for grace found its ultimate expression in a celestial symphony. Hidden among the caves was a cycle of 13 mystical hymns known as the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice. This was not a text of laws or prophecies, but a liturgical masterpiece, a songbook for the heavens. Each of its 13 songs was composed for one of the first 13 Sabbaths of the year, transforming the weekly day of rest into a spiritual ascent. The community did not merely rest on the Sabbath, they traveled. Their destination was not a place on any map, but the innermost chamber of the universe, the heavenly temple itself. The songs guide the worshipper through this divine architecture with awe-struck precision. They describe the structure's magnificent pillars and foundations of sapphire, its pavement of ruby, and its walls adorned with jewels that blaze with an unearthly light. This is the true, eternal temple, of which the one in Jerusalem was considered a flawed, earthly copy, and within this sanctuary the real liturgy is perpetual. The songs depict the angelic priesthood in constant motion, a celestial choir of multiple priestly orders. There are the chief princes, the deputy princes, and the ministers of the inner sanctum, all moving in a complex, holy dance of praise. Their worship is not silent. The text records their antiphonal calls, the blessings they chant back and forth to one another. The language is highly repetitive and hypnotic, building layer upon layer of sound and imagery. The same phrases of blessing and glory echo again and again, not as a lack of creativity, but as a deliberate technique. This repetition is meant to induce a trance-like state, to quiet the human mind and lift the soul into the rhythm of eternity. The central enigma of these songs is their profound purpose. Was this a text for actual communal worship? Did the sect gather each Sabbath to chant these words aloud, believing that their human voices were somehow blending with the angelic chorus, uniting earth with heaven in a single cosmic service? The very act of recitation would have been an act of unification, a mystical joining that made them participants in the true worship that never ceases. Or was this a meditative guide for the individual, a private spiritual exercise meant to help a single believer envision the celestial liturgy? In the solitude of their cell, a member could close their eyes and follow the songs, using the hypnotic language to block out the mundane world and project their consciousness into the divine throne room. The answer is likely that it was both. The songs of the Sabbath sacrifice provided a technology of transcendence. For a community that believed the earthly temple was corrupt, these hymns offered a way to bypass the failed human institution entirely and worship directly in the presence of God alongside His holy ones. They were not just remembering a distant heaven, they were acoustically building it around themselves every seventh day until the walls between worlds felt thin enough to touch. The sacred library at Qumran was not just a collection of scriptures, it was an arsenal of arguments. Among its most revealing weapons is a text known as the Testimonia, a single sheet of parchment that reads like a theological briefing document. It is not a narrative or a poem, but a curated list of 5 biblical quotations, strung together without any commentary or explanation. This was a ready-made compilation of proof texts, a concise scriptural roadmap to the end of the world. The first quote is a blockbuster drawn from the Book of Deuteronomy. It is the prophecy about a prophet like Moses whom God would one day raise up, a figure to whom everyone must listen. This sets a foundational expectation, a coming leader with the authority of the lawgiver himself. Immediately following this, the text leaps to the star prophecy from the Book of Numbers. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. This was a classic text of royal menism, pointing to a king, a descendant of David, who would crush the enemies of God's people. The third quotation shifts the focus from the throne to the altar. It presents the blessing of Levi from the same passage in Deuteronomy, which establishes the eternal priesthood for that tribe. This was the scriptural warrant for a priestly Messiah, an anointed figure from the line of Aaron who would oversee the pure worship of the final age. The compiler of this list then makes a breathtaking connection. He adds a fourth, non-biblical passage from a text known as the Psalms of Joshua, which speaks of a specific figure of Belial, a destroyer who would arise to lead Israel astray. This villain serves as the antagonist, the necessary enemy in the coming apocalyptic drama. The central enigma of the Testimonia is its stark, unadorned presentation. Why simply list these verses without any interpretation? The answer lies in its purpose. This was not a text for teaching beginners. It was a reference tool, a concise summary of core beliefs for those already initiated into the community's worldview. Every member would have understood the profound implications of linking these specific prophecies together. They were building a composite portrait of the final act of history, one that required multiple messianic actors. A prophet to reveal God's final word, a king to wield political and military power, and a priest to mediate divine purity. This threefold expectation solved a theological problem. It prevented the concentration of all power in a single, potentially corruptible individual, a clear critique of the Hasmonean rulers who had merged the roles of king and high priest. The Testimonia is a snapshot of a living, breathing hermeneutic, a way of reading the Bible that saw scattered verses as pieces of a single, divine puzzle coming together in their own time. To hold this fragment is to hold a classified document from a community that believed it had cracked the code of Scripture, and was now simply waiting for the prophecies to step out of the parchment and into their world. This cosmic struggle between two spirits was not just an idea, it was the very engine of their existence. The treatise on the two spirits, a profound section embedded within the community rule, presents a universe locked in a divine tug-of-war. It explains that from the God of knowledge comes all that is and ever will be, and before they were created, God appointed two spirits for humanity to walk in until the time of his final visitation. These are the spirit of truth, born from a spring of light, and the spirit of deceit, emerging from a well of darkness. The Prince of Light leads the children of righteousness, while the angel of darkness holds dominion over the children of deceit. Every human heart becomes the battlefield where these two forces contend, a constant internal conflict between light and darkness, truth and falsehood. The text meticulously lists the characteristics of each spirit. The spirit of truth produces a love for all that is good, a spirit of humility, patience, and compassionate judgment. Its fruits are wise understanding and a fervent zeal for righteous laws. The spirit of deceit, however, is the source of greed, dishonesty, pride, deceit, and cruelty. It cultivates a shortness of temper and abundant folly. According to the treatise, every person's life is a mixture of these two inheritances, a distribution where one spirit will always hold greater influence, but the other is never entirely absent. This duality explains the perplexing reality of evil in a world created by a good God. It was not that God created evil itself, but that he established the framework for this conflict, setting boundaries for the spirit of deceit and even using its actions for his own ultimate mysterious purposes. The central enigma of this treatise lies in its remarkable similarity to Zoroastrian beliefs. The Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, which predates the scrolls, is built upon a cosmic dualism between Ahura Mazda, the god of light and wisdom, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of darkness. The parallels are too striking to ignore, from the personification of the two forces to their association with light and darkness, truth and the lie. This raises a fascinating historical question. How did these distinctly Persian ideas find their way into the theology of a strict Jewish sect in the Judean desert? The most likely answer lies in the exile. Centuries before, the Jewish people had lived under Persian rule after the Babylonian exile. During this long period of contact, profound theological cross-pollination occurred. The Jewish exiles, grappling with their own tragedy and the nature of evil, may have found in Zoroastrian dualism a powerful framework that helped explain their suffering without compromising God's ultimate sovereignty. They adapted these foreign ideas, weaving them into the fabric of their own biblical faith, creating a unique synthesis that saw the entire drama of history as a predetermined conflict moving toward a final, decisive judgment. This creates a profound tension within the text. The community believed in a strict determinism, that God had preordained the paths of the two spirits and the ultimate destiny of every person. Yet, the treatise on the two spirits is also a call to radical moral choice. The entire point of the community rule was to consciously align oneself with the spirit of truth through a life of ritual purity, shared property, and strict obedience. They believed their way of life was a spiritual technology, a method to consciously choose the spirit God had already appointed for them, to purify themselves from the clinging influence of deceit. Their free will was the mechanism through which divine determinism was realized. To read this treatise is to witness a community trying to hold two seemingly opposite truths in balance, that God is utterly sovereign, and yet human choice matters eternally. It was this delicate, powerful belief that fueled their daily rituals and their patient wait in the desert, convinced that every act of kindness, every moment of study, was a deliberate step taken in a war that was both cosmic and intensely, intimately personal. A single, damaged fragment known as the Prayer for King Jonathan shatters the image of a community utterly separate from the world it condemned. This tiny text, catalogued as 4Q448, contains a psalm of praise to God, but its most explosive line is a plea for the welfare of King Jonathan. The name itself is a historical detonation. Most scholars are convinced this refers to Alexander Jannaeus, the brutal Hasmonean king and high priest who ruled with an iron fist in the early 1st century before the Common Era. This is the very figure other scrolls vilify as a wicked priest, a corrupt ruler who persecuted the sect's own teacher of righteousness. So why would a community that saw his regime as the embodiment of evil preserve a prayer asking for his well-being? The enigma forces us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about their isolation. One compelling theory suggests the prayer was not a genuine wish for the king's success, but a deeply subversive act. In the ancient world, to know the true name of a person or a spiritual entity was to hold power over them. By inscribing the king's name within a sacred text, the community may have been engaging in a form of ritual magic, a prayer intended to bind him or even call down divine judgment upon his head. They were not praying for his welfare, but attempting to control his fate through the ultimate authority of God. Another possibility is that the prayer represents a faction within the broader movement, a group that held a more accommodating view toward the political powers of the day. The scrolls library was not a monolith. It contained texts copied over 2 centuries, reflecting a diversity of thought. Perhaps this fragment is a minority report, a voice arguing for a less confrontational relationship with the ruling authorities, a pragmatic desire to survive in a dangerous world. Or the prayer could be a later addition penned after the king's death, transforming his name into a symbolic stand-in for all wicked rulers, a perpetual reminder of God's ultimate sovereignty over tyrants. The most challenging interpretation is that the sect's relationship with the powers in Jerusalem was far more complex and nuanced than a simple story of total rejection. There may have been moments of truce, periods of uneasy coexistence, or even individuals within the community who maintained some form of contact. This tiny, contradictory scrap of parchment proves they were not deaf to the political realities of their time. They were not simply staring at the heavens, but were also reading the headlines, and their response was as complicated and conflicted as any human reaction to power. It reveals a community that could both curse a king in one text and invoke his name in another, a testament to the messy, unpredictable reality of faith living under the shadow of an empire. Yet even the most personal prayer was governed by a celestial clock. Among the most numerous and technical texts found in the caves are the calendrical documents, scrolls entirely dedicated to mapping the passage of time. These were not simple schedules, they were declarations of war against the religious establishment in Jerusalem. At their heart lies a single, perfect number, 364. This was the length of their sacred year, a solar calendar divided into 4 equal seasons of exactly 91 days each. Every date, every festival fell on the same day of the week every single year. The Feast of Weeks, for instance, always fell on a Sunday. This mathematical perfection was, for them, a reflection of the divine order of the universe itself. The enigma is why this seemingly dry administrative detail became a hill they were willing to die on. The conflict was not a minor squabble over dates, it was a fundamental clash over who held the authority to interpret God's covenant. The temple in Jerusalem operated on a lunar calendar, a system of 12 months that followed the phases of the moon. This calendar was irregular, requiring the periodic addition of a 13th month to keep it aligned with the solar seasons. For the Qumran community, this was an unthinkable compromise. They saw the lunar calendar as a human invention, a flawed and impure system that caused God's own appointed feasts to drift, to be celebrated on the wrong days. By following their perfect solar calendar, they were not just keeping a different schedule, they were making a breathtaking claim. They alone were in sync with the heavenly timetable, the rhythm God had established at creation. Their priests were serving in the true, liturgical time of the angels, while the priests in Jerusalem were stumbling in the dark, offering sacrifices on days God had not ordained. This was the ultimate act of separation. When the rest of Judea was fasting, they might be feasting. When the temple was celebrating a pilgrimage festival, they were in their desert community, observing an ordinary day, believing the entire nation was engaged in a form of idolatry, worshipping on a false schedule. The calendar was their proof that they were the true Israel, the faithful remnant waiting in the wilderness for a time when God would force everyone to set their clocks by his Son. To abandon their calendar would have been to surrender their entire identity, to admit that the corrupt Jerusalem priesthood had the right to tell time for God. They chose instead to live by the light of a different sun, convinced that their perfect count of days was the only thread connecting a fallen earth to a perfect heaven. The perfect count of days demanded a perfect conversation with God. While the community lived by their celestial calendar, they also spoke to the divine on a strict weekly schedule through a collection known as the Words of the Luminaries. These were not spontaneous, personal prayers, but a formal cycle of communal liturgies, one for each day of the week, recited together as a single voice. They form one of the oldest surviving prayer books in the world, a structured dialogue between a people and their Creator. Each prayer follows a powerful, repetitive pattern. It begins by recounting a chapter from the sacred history of Israel, from the creation of the world to the Exodus from Egypt. But this is not a proud retelling of glorious victories. It is a communal confession. The prayers openly acknowledge the stubbornness of their ancestors, their repeated failures, and the sins that led to exile and suffering. "We have sinned, we have been guilty," the community declares in unison, taking ownership of a flawed past as their own present reality. This historical review then turns into a passionate plea. Having confessed the pattern of sin, they beg God for a future redemption that will finally break the cycle. They ask for a gathering of the dispersed, for a pouring out of God's Holy Spirit, and for the strength to walk in His ways forever. The prayers weave together memory and hope, creating a spiritual rhythm where acknowledging failure becomes the very foundation for expecting grace. The central enigma of these liturgies is their role in the community's daily life. Were these prayers recited at dawn in their assembly hall, the rising sun over the Dead Sea illuminating the faces of the men chanting these ancient words? Did the specific prayer for Wednesday, with its particular focus, shape the entire mood of that day's work and study? Their existence suggests a highly organized liturgical life, a far cry from the image of a loose collection of ascetics. They point to a group that sanctified time itself, not just through their calendar, but through the daily repetition of a shared story of sin and salvation. This practice raises a profound question about the history of worship. Does this fixed prayer cycle represent a revolutionary step, a move towards standardized liturgy that would later become central to both rabbinic Judaism and Christian monasticism? Were the people of Qumran pioneers creating a template for how a community could speak to God together, day after day, year after year? The words of the luminaries offer a precious window into the heartbeat of the community. Beyond the grand apocalypses and the strict rules, this was the steady pulse of their faith, the daily, humble work of remembering who they were, who God was, and what they desperately hoped He would yet do. Yet even their structured prayers left room for a deeply personal cry of thanks. A collection of hymns known as the Barkai Nafshi texts begins with a familiar and intimate command, "Bless the Lord, O my soul." This opening echoes the biblical Psalms, but these songs are a unique treasure from Qumran. They are poetic outpourings of gratitude, celebrating God's deliverance in language that feels both universal and intensely private. The hymns paint vivid pictures of divine rescue, describing God as one who raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the garbage dump. This is the language of someone who has known profound desperation and has felt a tangible, life-altering rescue. The poet gives thanks for very physical blessings, for food that satisfies the hungry soul, and for a divine guidance that illuminates a dark and confusing world. The tone is one of awestruck wonder at a personal God who intervenes directly in the affairs of individuals. The central enigma of these beautiful hymns is their origin. They sound so much like the biblical Psalms, sharing their poetic structure, their emotional range, and their core vocabulary of praise and thanksgiving. This striking similarity presents scholars with a fascinating puzzle. Were these hymns composed by the Qumran sect itself, new psalms written to express their own unique experiences of God's grace in the desert? If so, they reveal a community that was not just preserving old texts, but actively creating new and powerful liturgy, continuing the ancient tradition of sacred songwriting. Or do these texts point to something else entirely? Perhaps the Barkai Nafshi hymns were not composed at Qumran, but were part of a much broader and richer collection of liturgical poetry that was circulating widely in Jewish society at the time. The biblical Book of Psalms, as we know it, may have been just one anthology among many, and these hymns are surviving fragments of that lost world of song. They are a reminder that the walls of the biblical canon were not yet fixed, and that the spirit of praise was overflowing, creating new expressions of faith that resonated with the hopes and struggles of everyday people. To read them is to hear a chorus of voices, both from the desert and beyond, all joining in a single, timeless refrain of gratitude for a soul that has been blessed against all odds. The voice of a priest echoes across the centuries, not from the temple in Jerusalem, but from the desert. The Aramaic Levi document is a testament attributed to Levi, the founding patriarch of the priestly tribe, and it lays out a breathtaking vision of what it means to serve God. Written in the everyday Aramaic of the time, this text presents itself as Levi's own deathbed speech to his children, a sacred charge passed down through the generations. He instructs them in a sweeping range of priestly duties, from the intricate details of sacrificial rituals to the profound importance of moral purity. This is not just a job description, it is a spiritual calling of the highest order. The text emphasizes that a true priest must be a master of wisdom, not only in religious law but also in practical knowledge, and his personal conduct must be as spotless as the white linen robes he wears. The ideal priest is a perfect blend of learning, piety, and action, a human bridge between a holy God and a flawed people. The central enigma of this document is its powerful connection to another text found in the caves, the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. The Aramaic Levi document appears to be a direct source, a first draft for the later, more polished Testament of Levi. The core themes are identical, the focus on priestly purity and the dire consequences of failing that standard. This literary relationship proves that the Qumran community was not just collecting random texts, they were curating a library that traced the development of their most cherished ideas, building a paper trail of authority for their own priestly identity. Most importantly, the Aramaic Levi document is a clear, early argument for a priestly Messiah. By elevating Levi and his descendants as the ultimate model of holiness, the text makes a powerful theological statement. It argues that the true leader of God's people in the final age will not be a king alone, but a priest, a Messiah from the line of Aaron. This directly supported the community's cherished belief in a dual messiahship, where a priestly figure would hold ultimate religious authority, restoring a worship so pure it had been lost for generations. For the men who copied and preserved this scroll, it was more than an ancient story. It was their own mission statement. They saw themselves as the true sons of Levi, the faithful priests living in the wilderness while the establishment in Jerusalem wallowed in corruption. This text validated their entire existence, justifying their separation and fueling their hope that they were the keepers of a flame that would one day ignite the world. To read the Aramaic Levi document is to understand the very heart of their rebellion. A quiet, determined insurgency fought not with swords, but with ink, ritual, and an unwavering conviction that they alone remembered how to speak to God. The choice between light and darkness was made at a deathbed. In a powerful Aramaic text known as the Visions of Amram, we witness the final moments of Amram, the father of Moses and Aaron, as he gathers his children to impart a terrifying vision. This is not a simple farewell, but a dramatic account of a cosmic confrontation that determined the destiny of his lineage. Amram describes how he was confronted by two awe-inspiring figures, each vying for his soul. One had a terrifying, serpent-like face, a visage of pure darkness. This was Melchiresha, whose name means King of Wickedness, the Prince of Darkness. The other was a being of glorious light, identified as the Prince of Light. In his vision, these two celestial princes were locked in a bitter legal dispute over who had ultimate authority over humanity, and they demanded that Amram himself choose between them. The fate of his children and the future of Israel hung on his decision. The central enigma of this text is its profound personalization of a cosmic war. The treatise on the two spirits presented this conflict as a theological concept, but here it becomes a vivid, sensory experience for a single man. Amram is not a passive observer, he is the prize. His choice is not about abstract ideas of good and evil, but a direct, conscious alignment of his entire being with one spiritual authority over the other. This narrative provides a stunning backdrop for the entire Moses story. It frames the life of Moses, the great liberator, and Aaron, the first high priest, as the direct result of their father's righteous choice. The text suggests that the conflict between the Israelites and the Pharaoh was not merely a political struggle, but the earthly manifestation of this same celestial battle. The Pharaoh, stubborn and cruel, is aligned with the dominion of Melchizedek, while Moses, the lawgiver, operates under the authority of the Prince of Light. The two angelic figures are not just fighting for Amram's soul, they are fighting for the soul of a nation yet to be born. To read the visions of Amram is to see the grand sweep of Exodus reframed as a family drama with cosmic stakes, where a patriarch's vision in the dark of an Egyptian night set the stage for a confrontation that would split a sea and shape a faith. The law was not a set of suggestions, but a fortress wall against the world. Within the caves, collections known as the ordinances reveal how this wall was built, brick by legal brick. These texts are not grand prophecies, but meticulous rulings on the gritty details of daily life, from the food you ate to the money you tithed. They represent the community's radical claim that they alone understood and practiced the true law of Moses, and every ruling was a line drawn in the sand, separating them from everyone else. Take the laws of tithes, the mandatory offerings of one's agricultural produce to support the priests and the temple. The mainstream practice in Jerusalem, influenced by Pharisaic tradition, was seen by the Qumran community as dangerously lax. The ordinances insist on a much stricter interpretation, demanding tithes not only from grain, wine, and oil, but also from lesser-known plants and herbs mentioned in the law. For them to overlook even the smallest seed was to rob God, a sin that defiled the entire community. Their rulings on ritual purity were even more demanding. While the temple authorities had developed complex systems for purification, the ordinances often extended these laws into the home. They might insist on a specific number of immersions for a particular minor impurity, or define a contaminating liquid in a far broader way than the Jerusalem priesthood. These were not minor quibbles. To them, the Pharisees were blind guides who had created loopholes and fences that ultimately diluted God's command. The Qumran sect believed that God's law was a perfect, seamless whole, and any compromise, no matter how small, was a crack that would eventually bring the entire structure down. The laws for the Sabbath provide a perfect example of this gulf. The mainstream Jewish world debated what constituted work on the day of rest. Could you untie a knot? How far could you walk? The ordinances offer their own stark answers. They explicitly forbid pulling an animal out of a pit on the Sabbath, a ruling that directly contrasts with the more lenient, life-preserving view held by others. For this desert community, the absolute rest of the Sabbath was a divine statute that could not be broken, even for a valuable ox. The preservation of the day's holiness took precedence over practical economic concerns. This created the central enigma of their existence. How did this obsessive focus on legal minutiae define a spiritual identity? The answer is that their law was their language of holiness. By observing these stricter rules, they were physically enacting their belief that they were the true, set-apart people of God. Every meal eaten according to their purity laws was a silent sermon against the defiled food in Jerusalem. Every Sabbath observed with such rigidity was a declaration that they were keeping time with God while the rest of the world was out of sync. Their legal interpretations were not a burden, but a sacred technology for building a human society that mirrored the perfect order of heaven. To follow the ordinances was to walk a narrow, difficult path that they believed led directly into the presence of God, a path from which all others had tragically strayed. The law was a fortress wall, but the wisdom it protected was the key to the entire fortress. Another scroll dares to name this key, calling it the mystery that is to come. This text, known simply as the Book of Mysteries, plunges into the deepest waters of divine knowledge, claiming to reveal God's predetermined plan for all of history. Its language is poetic and profound, a series of stark contrasts that sound like proverbs from another world. It declares that there is a time for truth and a time for deceit, a time for knowledge and a time for folly. This is not a simple observation about human nature. It is a cosmic diagnosis. The text presents the entire universe as a grand duality, a stage where two fundamental forces, wisdom and foolishness, are locked in a battle that was scripted from the very beginning. The central enigma of this scroll is the content of the mystery itself. What is this secret knowledge? The text is deliberately cryptic, but it points toward a breathtaking revelation. The mystery is the full, comprehensive understanding of God's master plan for creation and its final, inevitable judgment. It is the hidden blueprint of reality, the reason why everything happens as it does, from the rising of the sun to the fall of empires. This was not knowledge one could gain through study or reason alone. It was a form of divine revelation, a gift of insight granted only to the righteous, the members of the community who had separated themselves from the world of folly. To them, this wisdom was the ultimate dividing line. It set them apart as the truly enlightened, the only people on earth who understood how the story would end. They believed they possessed the decoder ring for the universe, a spiritual lens that allowed them to see past the chaos of current events and perceive the steady, unstoppable march of God's will. The scroll speaks of a final reckoning, a moment when the mystery will be fully unveiled for all to see, when the ways of truth and deceit will be judged with perfect justice. This knowledge was not meant to make them passive, but to galvanize them. It gave their harsh desert existence a profound sense of purpose. Every ritual bath, every shared meal, every copied line of scripture was an act of alignment with the mystery, a conscious choice to stand on the side of divine knowledge against the prevailing folly of the age. To read the Book of Mysteries is to witness a community that believed it held the secret of the ages, a truth so powerful it could transform a barren wilderness into the antechamber of eternity. But the ultimate mystery was not a cosmic plan, but a tangible, predatory danger. Among the scrolls, one text presents a figure of pure malevolence, a chilling personification of evil known only as the wicked woman. This is not a vague spiritual force, but a vividly drawn character who stalks the righteous, her voice dripping with flattery and her heart filled with sinister schemes. The text, called The Wiles of the Wicked Woman, reads like a wanted poster for a soul, describing her in terrifyingly specific detail. She lies in wait at every corner, her eyes scanning for a blameless man to ensnare. Her lips drip with honey, but her heart is a trap of razor wire. She is adorned with alluring colors and perfumes, a deliberate facade designed to mask the rot within. The imagery is starkly physical and deeply negative, drawing directly from the warnings against the forbidden woman in the biblical book of Proverbs. She is portrayed as a predator, her house a gateway to the underworld, and her bed a pit of corruption from which no one who enters can ever escape. Her ultimate goal is to divert the righteous from the paths of justice and to lead them astray from the fear of God. The central enigma of this text is its true target. Who or what is this wicked woman meant to represent? One interpretation takes the text at face value, seeing it as a stern, literal warning against sexual immorality. In this reading, she is a real, dangerous seductress, a symbol of the physical and spiritual defilement that awaited any member who strayed from the community's strict moral code into the arms of the outside world. Her alluring perfumes and colorful robes represent the sensual temptations of a society the sect had rejected. Yet other scholars hear a more sophisticated, metaphorical meaning. They argue the wicked woman is not a person at all, but a symbol of foreign wisdom or heretical teachings. In this view, her seductive words represent the appealing but false philosophies of other Jewish groups, like the Pharisees or the Sadducees, whose interpretations of the law were seen as a poisonous deviation from the truth. Her flattery is the siren call of compromise, luring the faithful away from the sect's rigid purity and into theological error. A third, even more pointed interpretation suggests she is a symbol for a specific, opposing ideology. Some propose she represents Hellenism, the pervasive Greek culture that had infiltrated Judea, with its focus on beauty, philosophy, and reason. all of which were seen as a direct threat to the revealed truth of God's law. Others wonder if she is a cipher for a rival political faction, a group whose influence was as seductive and ultimately as deadly as any physical temptation. The very existence of this text reveals the psychological landscape of the desert community. They saw the world beyond their boundaries not just as incorrect but as actively, personally malevolent. It was not merely a place of error but a predatory entity that hunted them, using every weapon from physical desire to intellectual deception to drag them back into the abyss. The Wicked Woman was their name for this entire system of corruption, a single, terrifying face put on the abstract fear that their hard-won holiness could be stolen from them in a moment of weakness. To read this scroll is to feel the paranoia and the fierce, desperate resolve of a group that believed it was surrounded by a beautiful, smiling enemy. Yet the predatory danger of the Wicked Woman was not merely a symbolic threat, it was a physical force believed to invade the very body. Among the scrolls of high theology and cosmic law, one fragile fragment stands apart for its raw, practical power. Known as the Exorcism text, this is not a philosophical treatise but a direct incantation, a verbal weapon designed to expel evil spirits believed to cause disease and suffering. The text speaks to demons directly, commanding them to leave their human victim. Its language is not a request but a forceful decree, invoking the authority of a higher power to banish the malevolent entity. The incantation might command a demon to depart to the abyss or to be bound in chains, its power broken by the sacred words. This was spiritual warfare made tangible, a battle for the health of a single afflicted person. The central enigma of this text lies in its very existence among the lofty scrolls of the community. How was this practical exorcism actually performed? Was it recited aloud by a specially appointed member over a sick person, perhaps with ritual actions or the use of holy water? Did they write the incantation on a piece of parchment to be worn as an amulet? The text offers no stage directions, only the potent words themselves. Its presence forces us to reconsider the community's daily life. For all their sophisticated theology about the Prince of Darkness and the Spirit of Deceit, they also believed that these cosmic forces could manifest as specific demons causing physical illness. This fragment reveals a stunning blend of elite religion and popular folk magic. It shows that their rigorous intellectual world, with its complex laws and angelology, coexisted with a very ancient, visceral belief in healing rituals and direct spiritual intervention. They were not just theologians, they were also healers. The same hands that meticulously copied the perfect laws of the temple scroll could also pen this urgent plea for deliverance from a fever or a pain. This was not a contradiction to them, but two sides of the same coin, two different tools for fighting the same enemy in a world they saw as thick with invisible, hostile powers. The exorcism text is a humble, powerful reminder that even the most disciplined faith still lives in trembling human bodies, and that the battle between light and darkness could be fought with a whispered word in a darkened room. The copper map has never lacked for believers willing to risk everything. One of the most determined was John Allegro, a scholar whose name became synonymous with both the scrolls and controversy. In the 1960s, Allegro became convinced he had cracked the code. He led a daring expedition into the brutal Judean desert, following the scroll's cryptic clues with a fervor that bordered on obsession. His team dug frantically at the base of a cliff near Qumran, sure they were moments from uncovering a hidden chamber filled with temple gold. They found nothing but rock and sand. Allegro's quest ended in professional disgrace, his theories widely dismissed as reckless fantasy, a cautionary tale of how the copper scroll could consume a brilliant mind. Yet his failure did not extinguish the dream. Modern treasure hunters have traded shovels for technology, sweeping the same arid landscapes with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery. They search for anomalies, for hollow spaces underground that might match the descriptions of sealed chambers and forgotten tunnels. The scroll itself points to specific, maddeningly obscure locations. It mentions a place called Solomon's Canal, a waterway lost to history. Was this an actual aqueduct from the time of the kings, its location now buried under 2 millennia of dust? Another entry directs seekers to the Monument of Absalom, a known tomb in the Qumran Valley, but the precise spot, the exact cubit where treasure was buried, remains a frustrating mystery. The practical challenges are immense. The terrain itself is a hostile accomplice to the secret. Flash floods can erase landmarks in an hour, and shifting sands have buried entire valleys. What was a clear gully 2,000 years ago might now be a featureless plain. Then there is the human factor. The scroll warns that some of the treasure is hidden in a location that is also a grave, a place of ritual impurity that would have deterred any pious searcher. Was this a deliberate safeguard, a spiritual booby trap to protect the hoard? The central question persists through every failed expedition. Why has no significant part of this colossal treasure ever been found? The most haunting possibility is that it was discovered long ago, not by archaeologists but by Roman soldiers or Bedouin looters in the centuries after the scroll was written. The treasure could have been melted down, its sacred objects stripped of their identity and scattered across the empire, leaving only a cryptic inventory as its ghost. Or perhaps the map was always a decoy, an elaborate fiction designed to send enemies on a wild goose chase while the real treasure was hidden elsewhere, its true location known only to a select few who took the secret to their graves. The copper scroll endures not as a solved puzzle but as an open invitation. It is a story that refuses to end, a metallic whisper that still draws the hopeful into the wilderness, promising that the earth might yet yield a secret worth more than gold. The light that surrounded the infant Noah was not a gentle radiance but a terrifying, unearthly glow. His father Lamech looked upon his newborn son and felt a cold dread. The child's eyes were luminous, his skin seemed to shine from within, and his entire being was so unlike any human child that a horrifying thought seized the father's heart. He immediately suspected his wife, Enoch, of a cosmic transgression, of having lain with one of the Watchers, the fallen angels whose illicit unions had already filled the earth with monstrous giants. In a panic, Lamech confronts his wife, his accusations sharp with fear and betrayal. He demands the truth, for the child's very nature seems to condemn her. But Enoch's reply is a masterpiece of wounded sincerity. She swears a powerful oath, reminding Lamech of the pleasure and intimacy they shared when the child was conceived. She insists this is his son, born of their love, and she pleads with him to remember the truth of their own bed. Her words force Lamech to confront his own rash judgment, but his fear is not so easily quieted. Desperate for a definitive answer, he turns to the one person who might know the truth of such celestial matters, his own father, Methuselah. He begs Methuselah to journey even further, to seek out the ultimate source of wisdom, his own father Enoch, the man who walked with God and now resided among the heavenly beings. The entire family is caught in this web of doubt and divine mystery, their domestic peace shattered by a miracle they cannot understand. The story unfolds as a profound family drama, where the arrival of a savior first brings not joy but terror and the threat of scandal. This expansion transforms the sparse biblical verse into a gripping narrative of faith tested against the evidence of the impossible. Why would the authors of this apocryphon invest so much in this story of a frightened father and a shining baby? The enigma finds its answer in the core message of the text, by portraying Noah as divinely marked from birth, glowing with a purity that frightens his own family. The author establishes him as fundamentally separate from the corrupted world around him. He is not just a good man in a bad time, he is a new beginning, a human reset button. His very body is a protest against the contamination caused by the Watchers, a living beacon of the uncorrupted lineage that God would use to preserve creation. The light was not a sign of angelic parentage, but a seal of divine chosenness, setting him apart as the one who would carry the future through the coming flood. In a community that saw itself as a righteous remnant in a corrupt world, this story was a powerful mirror. They too felt set apart, misunderstood, and perhaps even feared by the mainstream society in Jerusalem. The tale of Noah's birth validated their own sense of being chosen, different, and illuminated by a truth that others could not comprehend. It was a story that assured them their separation was not a mistake, but a divine necessity, a shining prelude to a new creation. Within this holy brotherhood, a smaller, more elite circle held the reins of power. The community rule describes the council of the community, a governing body of 12 men and 3 priests. This was the inner sanctum of the sect, the ultimate authority on matters of law, doctrine, and discipline. The structure was a precise mirror of their cosmic beliefs, an earthly reflection of the divine order they worshipped. At its head stood the priest, the undisputed spiritual leader. He was to be the first in every assembly, the first to speak on any matter of law or judgment, and the first to receive his portion of food at their sacred meals. His authority was absolute because it flowed from his lineage. He was a son of Aaron, a direct descendant of the first high priest. Beside him, the text mentions another pivotal figure, the Messiah of Israel. This was the awaited royal figure from the line of Judah, the Davidic king who would one day lead them in battle. Yet here is the fascinating enigma in this idealized council. Even the Messiah of Israel is subordinate to the priest. The rule explicitly states that when they gather for a communal meal, the Messiah may not stretch out his hand to the bread before the priest has blessed it. This is a stunning hierarchy. The future king, the political and military liberator, must wait for the priest to act first. This arrangement reveals the community's core conviction: ultimate authority was not vested in the throne but in the altar. True order came not from political power but from ritual purity and the correct interpretation of God's law, a domain belonging exclusively to the sons of Aaron. The rest of the council, the 12 laymen, represented the 12 tribes of Israel, the restored and perfected nation. But the 3 priests among them ensured that the priestly voice was never outnumbered, that the sons of Aaron always had the final word. How did this work in the dusty reality of Qumran? They were waiting for a Messiah who had not yet arrived, so who filled that role in their daily meetings? The answer is that they likely lived in a state of perpetual preparation, their council structured as a perfect model, a placeholder government for a kingdom that was just over the horizon. Every meeting, every judgment they passed was a rehearsal for the Messianic age. They were building the framework of God's future reign, ensuring that when the Messiah finally did appear, the administrative and spiritual machinery would already be in place and running smoothly. This strict order was their answer to the chaos of the outside world. In Jerusalem, they saw a blasphemous fusion of power where kings appointed themselves as high priests. At Qumran, they drew a sharp, uncrossable line. The priest was the supreme interpreter of God's will, and the Messiah, when he came, would be the executor of that will. Their entire social structure was a protest carved into their daily routine, a declaration that they would not let a single meal begin until God's proper order was respected. To sit in their council was to participate in a living prophecy, to help build a world where the word of a priest mattered more than the sword of a king. 40 years of cosmic warfare reach their thunderous climax, and an unnerving silence falls upon the battlefield. The war scroll does not end with the last slain soldier of darkness, but with the meticulous work of cleansing and consecration that must follow. The victory of the sons of light is not complete with military triumph alone. It is only fulfilled in the absolute purification of the world for God's eternal habitation. The text describes the priests and Levites moving through the carnage, not to claim spoils, but to perform a sacred duty. They must cleanse the land and the temple from the contamination of death and foreign idolatry. Every weapon, every piece of armor that touched the profane must be ritually purified or utterly destroyed. This is a spiritual decontamination on a global scale, a resetting of creation's moral compass. The war itself was the violent, necessary surgery to cut out a cancerous evil, and now the long, careful healing could begin. Then the great Thanksgiving ceremony commences. The entire community, now representing a redeemed humanity, gathers for a service of unparalleled joy. The text provides the exact words of the hymns they are to sing, psalms of praise that recount God's mighty deeds in the battle. The chief priest stands and recites a long, poetic prayer, detailing the history of God's faithfulness and his final victory over the dominion of Belial. This is not a celebration of human strength, but a profound acknowledgement that the victory was God's alone, a divine gift granted to his faithful servants. The war was the prelude, but the worship is the eternal state. The scroll culminates in a vision of a world permanently transformed. With the forces of darkness vanquished and the temple purified, God's kingdom is established forever. This is the central enigma of the entire document. Was this elaborate battle plan a literal expectation, or was the war itself a powerful metaphor for the internal and external struggle required to usher in a messianic age? The answer seems to be that for the community, the two were inseparable. The violent conflict was the unavoidable birth pang of a new creation. They believed a world so thoroughly corrupted by evil could not be gently reformed. It had to be decisively broken and remade. The war was the traumatic final act of the old age, and the purified temple, with its perpetual songs of thanksgiving, was the first day of the new. Their profound hope was not for a better version of the present, but for a total transformation, a utopian age where the very possibility of evil was eradicated, and the only activity that remained was perfect, unending worship in a world finally, completely, and eternally at peace. The temple scroll reaches its most pointed critique in a section known as the Law of the King. Here, the voice of God delivers a constitution for a future ruler, placing constraints on his power that are both radical and deeply revealing. The text commands that the king must not acquire too many horses, a direct prohibition against building a large, offensive cavalry that could be used for imperial expansion. He is forbidden from sending people back to Egypt for this purpose, a clear rejection of foreign alliances and the military corruption that came with them. Most strikingly, the scroll dictates that the king must not acquire too much silver and gold, a profound limit on his personal wealth and his ability to finance a lavish, self-glorifying court. Perhaps the most personal restriction concerns his wives. The text insists he must not take many wives, lest they turn his heart away from God. This is not just a moral suggestion, it is a legal cap on political marriages that could compromise the nation's religious purity. Every one of these rules is a deliberate echo of the law for kings in the Book of Deuteronomy, but with a crucial difference: they are sharper, more explicit, and stripped of any ambiguity. The biblical version warns that too many horses, wives, and wealth will lead the king's heart astray. The temple scroll transforms this warning into a direct, enforceable command. It takes the conditional advice of Deuteronomy and turns it into the absolute law of a new covenant. So why would a desert sect feel the need to rewrite the biblical law for a king? The enigma points directly to the political reality of their time. When this scroll was written, Judea was ruled by the Hasmonean dynasty, a line of kings who also appointed themselves as high priests. These rulers maintained vast armies, accumulated enormous wealth, and engaged in the very political marriages the law condemned. They were the living embodiment of everything the temple scroll sought to prevent. This text is a devastating critique, a divine indictment against the corrupt fusion of political and religious power they saw in Jerusalem. It argues that the current monarchy was illegitimate, a blasphemous perversion of God's intended order. But the law of the king is more than just a protest, it is a blueprint for a messianic age. The community was not drafting laws for a present-day politician. They were writing the job description for a future king, the Messiah of Israel. This messianic king would be fundamentally different from the Hasmoneans. His power would be checked, his wealth limited, and his heart devoted to studying the law. Most importantly, he would be subservient. The scroll makes it clear that this king is subject to the authority of the priesthood. In the perfect society they envisioned, the ultimate interpreter of God's will was not the king but the priest, the Messiah of Aaron. The king would be the executor, the enforcer of a law he did not create and could not change. His role was to lead the army and govern the people, but always under the spiritual oversight of the true sons of Aaron. This creates a stunning vision of power divided, a constitutional monarchy ordained by God himself. The Temple Scroll's law of the king answers a profound question: what kind of liberator were they waiting for? They were not waiting for another tyrant, even a Jewish one. They awaited a humble king, a servant of the law, who would wield his sword only at the direction of God's priests. This was their dream, a ruler whose greatest power was his willingness to be limited, ensuring that the kingdom of God would never again become the kingdom of man. Enoch's gaze was not fixed only on fallen angels or celestial thrones. It also measured the precise mechanics of the sky. The astronomical book, another section of the Enochian library found at Qumran, pulls back the curtain on the cosmos to reveal a universe governed by strict mathematical laws. This text describes the sun and moon moving through 6 gates in the east and 6 in the west, their paths shifting with the seasons in a perfectly predictable dance. It details the phases of the moon, the varying lengths of daylight, and the influence of the wind on the stars. This is not vague poetry, but a detailed cosmic map, a divine user manual for the heavens. For the community in the desert, this was not speculative science. It was revealed truth handed down from the heavens to their ancient patriarch. The entire system operates on that sacred number, 364. The sun travels its circuit for exactly 364 days. Each of the 4 seasons lasts precisely 91 days. This perfect symmetry created a calendar that never changed, where every festival and every Sabbath fell on the same weekday, year after year, forever. The central enigma of this complex astronomy is its true purpose. Was this text intended as a literal scientific guide, an attempt to document the actual movements of celestial bodies for agricultural or navigational use? The meticulous detail suggests a deep fascination with the workings of the physical world, a belief that by understanding the sky, one could understand the mind of its creator. Yet the evidence points to a more profound theological motive. The primary goal was to legitimize their controversial calendar. By embedding their 364-day year within a heavenly vision granted to Enoch himself, they were making an unassailable claim. Their calendar was not a human invention. It was the original divine timetable for creation, witnessed by a prophet who walked with God. This directly challenged the lunar calendar used by the temple authorities in Jerusalem, which they saw as flawed, irregular, and ultimately a human corruption. The astronomical book transformed a calendrical dispute into a cosmic war. It was not merely a disagreement over dates, but a conflict between divine order and human error, between the perfect rhythm of the sun and the unreliable flicker of the moon. To follow the Jerusalem calendar was to be out of sync with the universe itself, to celebrate God's feasts on days he had not ordained. The movement of every star and planet, meticulously charted in this ancient text, became a silent witness against the religious establishment, proving that the desert sect alone was keeping time with the angels. Whose voice cries out from these ancient hymns? The question of the eye echoes through every line of the Thanksgiving hymns, a riddle wrapped in gratitude and grief. Is this the singular, anguished confession of a real man, their persecuted leader, or is it a poetic script for the entire community to sing as one? The text itself gives us powerful clues. In one hymn, the speaker describes being a target for the arrows of slanderers, a man whose own friends have become his accusers. He writes of being trapped like a bird in a snare, rescued only by God's direct intervention. The language is intensely personal, raw with the sting of betrayal and the terror of being hunted. This feels too specific, too visceral to be a mere metaphor. It reads like a diary entry from a man who knows his enemies by name. Many scholars hear in these lines the unmistakable voice of the teacher of righteousness, the sect's founding prophet. They believe he is describing his persecution at the hands of the wicked priest, a rival who pursued him even to his place of exile. When the poet thanks God for delivering him from the lion's den, he may be recalling a literal imprisonment or a narrow escape from a deadly ambush. His gratitude is not abstract, it is the profound relief of a man who has stared into the abyss and been pulled back at the last possible moment. Yet other hymns shift the perspective dramatically. The eye suddenly speaks of being founded upon a rock, an everlasting foundation. He describes himself as a source of living waters, a shelter for others. This sounds less like a suffering individual and more like the personified voice of the community itself, a collective that sees its role as a bastion of truth in a world of lies. One hymn declares, "You have set me as a banner for the chosen of righteousness, a standard for the works of truth." Is this a man, or is this the sect making a statement about its divine mission? This is the central enigma. The eye seamlessly flows between the deeply personal and the grandly corporate. It is a literary chameleon, capable of expressing the loneliness of a single soul and the shared identity of 1,000. The most likely answer is that it was both. The hymns may have originated in the profound personal experiences of their founding teacher. His trials became the archetype for the community's entire story. His rescue was the model for their salvation. Later, as the group grew, they adopted these powerful poems as their own communal prayers. When a new member sang, "You have rescued the soul of the poor from the power of the mighty," he was not just repeating the teacher's story, he was claiming it for himself, seeing his own struggles and hopes reflected in that timeless eye. This fluid voice makes the hymns eternally relatable. We are not just overhearing an ancient complaint, we are invited to step into the story ourselves, to find our own moments of despair and deliverance within its sacred lines. The mystery of the speaker is its greatest gift, a voice that is both a specific echo from the past and a universal cry that still waits for an answer. The prophet Habakkuk had trembled at the vision of the Chaldeans, but for the Qumran community, a new and terrifying empire filled that prophetic role. The Kittim, named so often in the Pesher, were the relentless force whose shadow fell across their world. The evidence pointing to Rome is overwhelming. The scroll describes the Kittim as sacrificing to their standards and worshipping their weapons of war. This is a chillingly precise depiction of the Roman army, whose legions carried sacred standards, the aquili, and performed religious rites to honor them. The text notes their governors and commanders come one after another, a perfect match for the rotating Roman proconsuls and military tribunes who governed conquered provinces. They are a distant nation whose language the author does not understand, and they come from the coastlands in ships, a clear reference to the Mediterranean power that projected its force across the sea. All of this aligns perfectly with the rise of Roman power in the region during the 1st century before the Common Era, the very time most of the scrolls were copied. This identification is not just an academic footnote, it is the key that unlocks the scroll's urgent, present-tense terror. The community believed the brutal, idolatrous Romans were not just a political problem, they were a theological certainty, the very instrument of God's wrath foretold by the prophets. Yet a compelling alternative theory pushes the timeline back. Could the Kittim be the Greeks, specifically the Seleucid Empire that ruled Judea before the Romans? The Seleucids, under the infamous Antiochus Epiphanes, had also desecrated the temple, sparking the Maccabean revolt. They too were a foreign power from across the sea, and their culture posed a massive threat to Jewish identity. This interpretation would make the Habakkuk Pesher a much older text, reflecting the traumas of the 2nd century before the Common Era. So which empire casts its long shadow over the text? The details of military practice, the specific mention of governors succeeding one another, and the historical context of the Qumran settlement itself all tilt the scales heavily toward Rome. The community saw in the Roman legions the ultimate embodiment of worldly power, arrogant, sacrilegious, and terrifyingly efficient. But by calling them Kittim, an ancient name for Cyprus, they were doing more than just using a code word. They were placing Rome within a prophetic tradition, linking them to the age-old enemies of God's people. This was how they made sense of their own powerlessness. The Romans were not an accident of history. They were a divine instrument, a punishing storm sent to chastise a faithless world, and their inevitable defeat was already written in the sacred texts. The true enemy was not the empire itself, but the spiritual darkness it represented, a force that would soon meet its own prophesied end. This cosmic Day of Atonement was not a quiet temple ritual, but a universe-shattering declaration. The scroll reinterprets the ancient command from Leviticus to proclaim liberty throughout the land, transforming it from a law about freeing Hebrew slaves every 50 years into a final, cosmic emancipation. Melchizedek, the heavenly high priest, stands at the center of this cataclysm. His voice does not echo in a man-made sanctuary, but across all of creation, announcing a release from a bondage far deeper than any physical chain. The captives he liberates are the souls of the righteous, held in the grip of Belial and his entire lot of dark spirits. This is the ultimate jubilee, the one that will reset the cosmos. But his proclamation has a terrifying double edge. For the forces of darkness, this liberty is a sentence. The scroll describes Melchizedek executing the vengeance of God's judgments, a divine warrior priest who not only sets the prisoners free but also personally carries out the punishment of their captors. The day of salvation for the sons of light is in the same moment the day of utter annihilation for the sons of darkness. The familiar temple ritual of Yom Kippur is completely overturned. In Jerusalem, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies once a year to sprinkle blood, atoning for the sins of Israel in a ceremony that had to be repeated every single year. The Melchizedek scroll declares this entire cycle obsolete. It presents a single, final, and perfect atonement that cleanses not just one nation, but the entire spiritual realm. The earthly ritual was merely a shadow, a yearly rehearsal for this ultimate reality. The enigma lies in this breathtaking transformation. How did a community so devoted to the strictest interpretation of law come to believe that the most sacred law of all was destined for such a radical upgrade? The answer is their profound disillusionment. They believed the temple in Jerusalem was so hopelessly corrupt that its rituals, even the Day of Atonement, had lost their power. The blood of bulls and goats could no longer atone for a world overrun by Belial. Only a heavenly high priest operating from a celestial temple could accomplish what earth could not. This was their hope, a final, divine intervention so complete it would make every previous ritual instantly ancient history. They were waiting for the day when the shadow would vanish and the true substance would appear, bringing either everlasting liberty or everlasting ruin. The 12 gates of the city are not mere entrances, but colossal structures wrought from a single, luminous pearl, each one towering to an impossible height. As you approach, the sheer scale is overwhelming, a declaration that this is a city built for giants or angels. The main street, paved with a polished, transparent stone, runs straight as a plumb line through the center, reflecting the unearthly light that emanates from the very walls. Every building, every foundation is faced with a specific precious stone. The foundations themselves are layered with jasper, sapphire, and emerald, the walls inlaid with bands of chalcedony and sardonyx, their colors shifting and deepening as you move. This is not just beauty, it is a geology of holiness, a city literally built from the treasures of God's creation. The angelic guide leads you deeper past courtyards lined with trees whose leaves never wither and whose fruit appears every single month, a perpetual, life-giving harvest. The air itself seems charged with a silent, resonant hum, the sound of perfect order. At the city's heart lies the temple complex, a structure so pure and geometrically perfect it makes the rest of the city seem almost mundane. Its altars and sanctums are arranged in precise, concentric squares, each courtyard representing a higher degree of holiness, a spiritual ascent mapped in stone and precious metal. The central enigma of this text is not just its architectural detail, but the profound sensory experience it was designed to create in the mind of the believer. To mentally walk these streets, to envision the cool, smooth pearl under your hand and see the flash of emerald in the walls, was to make the promised future more real than the disappointing present. For a community living in dusty isolation by the Dead Sea, this guided tour was a form of spiritual resistance. It reinforced their hope by giving them a tangible, breathtaking alternative to the compromised Jerusalem of their day, a city whose stones were stained by politics and whose rituals they saw as defiled. Every imagined jewel was a rejection of the corruption they had left behind. This vivid practice of imaginative visitation did not just offer comfort, it forged identity. It convinced them that their alienation from the physical city was not a punishment but a prerequisite. They were not exiles, they were scouts memorizing the map of their true home, a city waiting to descend from the heavens, where every gem was a prayer and every street a path back to God. The giant Maui awoke trembling, his colossal heart hammering against his ribs. He gathered his fellow Nephilim, the monstrous sons of the fallen watchers, and recounted a vision that had shattered his sleep. In the dream, he saw a great stone tablet covered from edge to edge with countless names. Then a hand appeared, plunging the tablet into a rushing river. The water surged over the inscribed surface, and when it was pulled out, the terrifying truth was revealed. Every name had been washed away, erased by the relentless current, except for 3. Only 3 names remained legible on the smooth, wet stone. A profound dread settled over the assembly of giants. They understood this was no ordinary nightmare, but a prophecy. The tablet represented all of creation, and the names were every living soul. The floodwaters were coming, a divine judgment that would cleanse the earth, leaving only a tiny remnant. The 3 names were the arc of the story written in water: Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sole survivors of the coming cataclysm. This dream fragment is a narrative enigma of breathtaking creativity. The Qumran authors were not merely repeating the biblical flood story, they were expanding its emotional and theological scope, asking a daring question. What was the experience of the doomed like just before the end? They gave a voice to the ultimate villains, the Nephilim, and in doing so, revealed a startling complexity. These giants were not just mindless beasts, they were conscious beings capable of receiving divine warnings and filled with a terror that mirrored human fear. The dream suggests that even the monstrous offspring of the Watchers were given a chance to understand their fate, to comprehend the absolute scale of the judgment that their very existence had provoked. This transforms the flood from a simple act of punishment into a more nuanced drama. The possibility of knowledge, and perhaps even a fleeting chance for repentance, is extended even to those beyond redemption. The story explores the heavy burden of foreknowledge, the psychological torment of knowing a verdict is final and inescapable. Why would a community of strict separatists spend their precious time and ink on the inner lives of pre-flood monsters? The answer lies in their own self-perception. Like the giants, they believed they possessed a secret understanding of impending divine judgment. They saw themselves as the enlightened remnant in a corrupt world, the ones who could read the writing on the wall, or in this case, the names on the tablet. The story of Maui's dream validated their own interpretations of prophecy and their choice to separate from a society they believed was destined for annihilation. It was a powerful reminder that when the final waters rose, only those whose names were written in the Book of Life would remain, a hope they clung to in their own desert exile. This ultimate feast was governed by a strict and unbreakable protocol. When the community gathered for the messianic banquet, no one could simply take a seat. The priest, the Messiah of Aaron, entered first and took his place at the head of the assembly. Only then could the Messiah of Israel, the royal Davidic figure, enter and sit beside him. The rest of the congregation, the men, the women, and the children, would then be seated according to their rank and spiritual standing. The meal could not begin until the priest stretched out his hand to bless the first portion of the bread and the new wine. This was the signal. Only after he had performed this sacred rite could the Messiah of Israel and then the entire assembly partake of the food. This was not a casual dinner party. It was a meticulously choreographed ritual of cosmic importance, a foretaste of the kingdom's hierarchy. The central enigma of this detailed description is its very nature. Was this a literal set of instructions for a real future feast they believed would happen when the Messiahs finally arrived, a catering plan for the end of the world? Or was it a liturgical practice the community was already performing in their own time, a symbolic meal they shared regularly to enact and anticipate the Messianic age? The answer likely lies in a profound blend of both. For this community, the line between future hope and present reality was thin. By ritually reenacting this banquet, they were not just waiting for redemption, they were actively rehearsing for it. They were building the future into their present, training their bodies and spirits for the day when the Messiahs would physically sit among them. Every shared loaf of bread, every blessed cup of wine, was a declaration of faith that the kingdom was both coming and, in a mysterious way, already present at their table. This vision reveals a belief in a redemption that was intensely physical and communal. They were not waiting to escape the earth as disembodied spirits, but to inherit a renewed earth where they would eat and drink with their anointed leaders. The Messianic age would be a time of shared meals and restored relationships, a tangible sensory experience of God's kingdom established on solid ground. Their hope was not for a ghostly heaven, but for a world made real again, a feast where every bite was a taste of a promise kept. The angelic priests are not described as individuals, but as a chorus of pure function. Their praise is a structure of sound built from sevenfold blessings that echo and overlap in an endless cycle. The text details their layered invocations, each one a perfect, repetitive chant of holiness and power. They do not speak with human words, but with a silent, radiant praise that emanates from their very being. This is not a language of petition or request, it is the sound of the universe in a state of perfect worship. Their vestments are woven from light itself, garments of splendor that reflect the divine glory they perpetually serve. The most powerful effect of these songs is their hypnotic rhythm. The same phrases of blessing and majesty are repeated again and again, not from a lack of creativity, but as a deliberate spiritual technique. This incantatory style was a form of acoustic architecture, building a staircase of sound for the human soul to climb. By chanting these words, the worshipper was not merely reading a description of heaven, they were using the rhythm to quiet their own mind and dismantle the barrier between earth and the divine throne room. The central enigma is the profound psychological shift this repetition was meant to trigger. It was a technology for transcendence, a way to bypass the chaos of ordinary thought and project the consciousness directly into the celestial liturgy. The community believed that by synchronizing their voices with the described praises of the angels, they could achieve a mystical union, joining the heavenly choir in real time. Their worship in the dusty meeting hall became a portal, and for the duration of the song, they were no longer in the desert, but standing among the foundations of sapphire, their own silent awe blending with the unceasing praise that fills the cosmos. Their calendar was a declaration of war against the temple itself. Imagine the scene in Jerusalem during the bustling pilgrimage festival of Passover. The city swells with worshippers, the air thick with the smoke of sacrifices, and the priests in their linen robes move through the courts performing the sacred rites. But in the quiet settlement of Qumran, there is no celebration. For the men and women living there, the date is wrong. According to their perfect solar calendar, the true Passover is still days away. They look toward the holy city not with reverence but with sorrow and condemnation. They believe the priests are slaughtering the Passover lamb on a day God did not appoint, rendering the entire ritual an abomination, a defiled offering that God cannot accept. This was the devastating practical consequence of their calendar. They were not just out of step with Jerusalem, they were living in a different liturgical time zone. The same rupture happened for the Feast of Weeks and the solemn Day of Atonement. While the high priest in Jerusalem entered the Holy of Holies to seek forgiveness for the nation, the Qumran community was engaged in an ordinary day's work, believing the atonement being sought was invalid. The temple's worship was not just imperfect, it was perpetually unclean, a continuous cycle of ritual error that polluted the land. This theological stance was the bedrock of their physical separation. Why live in the desert? Because the very heart of Israel, the temple, was beating to a false rhythm. They had to separate to remain pure. Their withdrawal was not an act of despair but of profound conviction. They believed they were the true Israel, the faithful remnant preserving the correct relationship with God while the rest of the nation, led astray by a corrupt priesthood, was stumbling in the dark. Their calendar was their proof. Its mathematical perfection mirrored the unchanging order of the heavens, while the lunar calendar of Jerusalem was a flawed, human invention that drifted with the unpredictable moon. By holding fast to their count of days, they were aligning themselves with the angels, worshipping in the true, celestial time while the earthly temple offered its sacrifices on days that simply did not exist on God's eternal clock. The enigma is how a disagreement over dates could become the very core of a religious identity. For them, it was everything. To accept the temple's calendar would have been to surrender their souls, to admit that God's will was ambiguous and that the corrupt establishment had the authority to dictate the terms of worship. Their calendar was the thread that connected them directly to the divine, a thread they refused to let the priests in Jerusalem sever. It justified their entire existence, transforming a small desert community into the keepers of a sacred flame, waiting for the day when all of Israel would finally be forced to reset its clocks. This cycle of failure and grace was not just a story, it was their story. The words of the luminaries methodically recount the stubbornness of their ancestors in the wilderness, their rebellion against Moses, and the golden calf, a moment of ultimate betrayal just after witnessing God's power. The prayers recall the period of the judges when the people would fall into sin, be handed over to their enemies, cry out for help, and be sent a deliverer, only to repeat the pattern all over again. They remember the kings who led the nation into idolatry, the prophets who were ignored, and the final, catastrophic exile that scattered the tribes. This is not a proud history of heroes, but a sobering confession of a nation's persistent failure to keep its promises to God. Why would a community recite such a litany of shame every single week? The enigma lies in the powerful identity this ritual forged. By repeatedly voicing the sins of their forefathers, they were not just remembering the past, they were actively distancing themselves from it. They were declaring, "We are not like our ancestors. We are the ones who have finally learned the lesson. We are the generation that has stopped the cycle by choosing exile in the desert over compromise in the city." This communal confession was the foundation of their claim to be the true, faithful remnant. The history lesson always culminates in a desperate plea, a direct appeal to God's own character. Having confessed the pattern of human failure, they beg God to act for His own sake, to remember His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They ask Him to gather their dispersed, to pour out His Holy Spirit upon them, and to give them an undivided heart to obey His laws. This was more than a prayer for personal blessing. It was a call for the final, definitive act of redemption. They were asking God to intervene in history one last time, not to send another temporary judge or king, but to shatter the cycle itself and establish his everlasting kingdom. Their entire way of life was an answer to this prayer in advance. By living in strict obedience and ritual purity, they believed they were creating the conditions for God to finally say yes. They were the faithful wife preparing for the return of her husband, the patient farmer tending the soil for the long-awaited rain. The daily recitation of this prayer cycle was a way of holding God to his promises, of reminding him and themselves that the story was not yet over and that they were the ones waiting in the wilderness for the final chapter to begin. The hymns of Baqai Nafshi reach into the deepest corners of the human heart, whispering of a God who is not just a cosmic judge but a father. The poet does not address a distant deity but a personal redeemer who has lifted his soul from the pit. He speaks of being gathered like a lost sheep, of God wiping away his tears and calming his troubled spirit. This is the language of intimate relationship, a stark contrast to the rigid legal codes and collective rituals that define the community's public life. How could a group so defined by its strict collective discipline also produce prayers of such raw, individual vulnerability? The enigma lies in this beautiful tension between the communal rule and the private soul. These hymns reveal that within the highly structured world of the Yahad, there was a vibrant inner chamber reserved for a personal encounter with the divine. The shared meals and ritual baths were the outer framework, but the Baqai Nafshi texts were the quiet, beating heart within that structure. They prove that the quest for purity did not erase the individual, but perhaps made the experience of God's personal care even more acute. A member could spend his day following every minute regulation, and then in the solitude of prayer, cry out to a father who knew his name, finding a comfort that no rulebook could ever provide. This was not a contradiction, but a completion. The law built the walls of the city, but these personal prayers lit the fires in every home, ensuring that even in a community of absolute unity, no soul was ever truly lost in the crowd. This struggle between light and darkness was never meant to be eternal. The treatise on the two spirits reaches its stunning climax with a divine deadline, a fixed moment in the future God has appointed for his final visitation. At this predetermined time, God himself will intervene to bring the cosmic war to a sudden, decisive end. He will utterly destroy the spirit of deceit, purging it from the hearts of humanity and from the world itself. All the suffering, all the internal conflict, and all the evil perpetrated by the angel of darkness will be swept away in a single, purifying act of judgment. This is the ultimate resolution, the moment when the duality is finally broken. The universe will not be locked in an endless battle between two equal forces. The Spirit of Truth, the source of all light and righteousness, will reign unchallenged forever. This belief transformed their entire existence. How could a community that believed in such a rigid divine plan also live with such intense daily discipline? The enigma lies in their role as conscious participants. They were not passive spectators waiting for a script to play out. They saw themselves as the vanguard of the sons of light, the frontline troops in a war whose victory was assured, but whose timeline demanded their active preparation. Their rigorous pursuit of holiness was not an attempt to change God's mind, but to align themselves perfectly with the outcome he had already decreed. Every ritual bath was a rehearsal for that final purification. Every shared meal was a taste of the messianic banquet to come. Every moment of study was a way to fill their minds with the truth that would soon be the only reality. They were polishing their souls for the final inspection, ensuring that when God arrived to test every human heart, they would be found gleaming on the side of light. Their strict daily life was a lived prophecy, a physical declaration that they believed the climax was near. To slacken their discipline would be to fall out of sync with the cosmic countdown, to risk being caught on the wrong side of a closing door. This powerful belief in a predetermined end did not paralyze them, it propelled them. It gave profound meaning to every tiny act of righteousness, framing it as a vital step in a divine drama racing toward its glorious, inevitable finale. That single prayer for King Jonathan shatters the illusion of a community living in total isolation from the world it condemned. So why would they pray for the very man they called the wicked priest? Scholars are locked in a fierce debate over this tiny fragment, a virtual courtroom where three compelling cases are presented. The first theory argues this was a genuine, albeit reluctant prayer. The community, for all its separation, was not immune to political reality. Living under a brutal and powerful regime, they may have felt compelled to offer prayers for the king's welfare as a matter of survival. It could have been a pragmatic act, a way to avoid drawing the wrath of a ruler known for his violent reprisals. In this reading, the prayer is not a sign of secret loyalty, but of quiet fear, a necessary concession to a dangerous world. A second, more dramatic theory turns the prayer on its head. What if the positive language is not sincere, but deeply subversive? In the ancient world, knowing a person's true name was believed to grant a form of power over them. By inscribing the king's name within a sacred text, the community could have been engaging in a potent form of ritual magic. The prayer, in this light, is not a plea for his well-being, but a carefully worded curse, an attempt to bind the wicked king or call down divine judgment upon his head. The respectful language becomes a layer of spiritual misdirection, a way to harness the power of God against his enemy without openly declaring war. This interpretation paints the scribe not as a frightened subject, but as a theological resistance fighter using his pen as a weapon. A third possibility challenges the very identity of the man being named. Could this Jonathan be someone else entirely? Perhaps he was not the hated king, but a different, more sympathetic figure from the sect's own history, a patron or a leader whose memory they cherished. Or maybe the name had become a symbolic stand-in for all ruling authorities, a generic placeholder in a standard prayer for those in power. This theory suggests we might be misreading the fragment through a modern lens, projecting our historical knowledge onto a text that held a different, more localized meaning. Each of these arguments forces us to rethink the black and white image of the desert sect. They were not monolithic in their thinking, and their relationship with the outside world was likely a complex dance of defiance, fear, and occasional necessary compromise. This one small piece of parchment proves that faith under pressure is never simple, and that the most enigmatic texts are often those that reveal the human contradictions behind the sacred rules. That metallic whisper from the past has proven louder than anyone could have imagined. The copper scroll's riddle of hidden treasure did not fade with the centuries. It ignited a modern obsession that has spawned its own sprawling legacy. This single document has become a cultural touchstone, inspiring countless novels that weave fictional heroes into its cryptic clues, and fueling documentaries that send cameras sweeping across the Judean desert in a perpetual state of hopeful search. The scroll's very existence is a conspiracy theorist's dream, offering a tantalizing link to lost temple wealth and secret knowledge guarded by shadowy ancient orders. Yet the most enduring mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is no longer confined to the caves of Qumran. It has moved into a far more treacherous landscape, the lucrative and shadowy world of the biblical antiquities market. In the early 2000s, a new wave of fragments began to appear. These were not found by Bedouin shepherds, but surfaced in the hands of private collectors, often accompanied by vague, unverifiable histories. They were tiny pieces of parchment, inscribed with Hebrew script that looked remarkably similar to the authentic scrolls. For a time, they were hailed as stunning new discoveries, filling gaps in our understanding. Museums and evangelical colleges paid millions for these fragments, believing they were expanding a sacred library. But then science began to speak. Advanced techniques like radiocarbon dating and microscopic ink analysis revealed a devastating truth. Many of these post-2002 fragments were sophisticated forgeries. The parchment was often genuinely ancient, carefully salvaged from other artifacts, but the writing was modern, skillfully applied to mimic 2,000-year-old script. The forgers had even recreated the mineral composition of authentic Dead Sea Scroll ink, a feat that required deep chemical knowledge. The scandal that erupted did more than expose fakes, it revealed a profound vulnerability. The desperate desire to possess a piece of this history, to own a tangible connection to the biblical world, had created a market where greed blinded caution. The lesson was harsh and clear. The same aura of sacred mystery that makes the Dead Sea Scrolls so compelling also makes them a perfect target for deception. This modern enigma forces a difficult question: how do we protect the truth of the past when it becomes a commodity for the present? The forgeries themselves are a backhanded tribute to the power of these ancient texts. They prove that the words from those desert caves still hold a value beyond gold, a value so immense that some are willing to manufacture it, creating new lies to be buried in the earth, waiting for the next generation of seekers to find. We have walked through a library of fire and faith, a collection of 50 voices preserved against impossible odds. These texts are far more than a single, unified doctrine. They reveal a world exploding with spiritual creativity, a vibrant marketplace of ideas where apocalyptic visions, strict legal codes, and mystical hymns coexisted and clashed. This was not a monolithic age of simple belief, but a crucible of intense debate about the nature of God, the problem of evil, and the hope for a world made new. The true, lasting mystery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is not the location of a copper treasure, but the breathtaking diversity of the human search for the divine. They show us the raw materials, the very DNA that would later shape the two great faiths of rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity. The questions they asked, the messiahs they awaited, and the battles they fought between light and darkness all echo through the centuries, right into our own time. We have heard the whispers of scribes, soldiers, and seers. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these 50 enigmatic texts captured your imagination? Was it the cosmic war, the copper treasure map, or the intimate prayers of a single soul? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe to join us on our next journey into the heart of history's greatest